Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been holding this experience in for over 30 years now, and I think it's finally time to share it. I've tried to explain it to people outside my family, but they either think I'm exaggerating or making it up entirely. But I know what we heard that day in April 1992, and it still gives me nightmares. I was 28 at the time, recently divorced from Mike, but still on decent terms. Our families had always been close, and we'd made plans months before to go crawfishing and camping for a weekend along Cypress Bayou in southern Mississippi. Despite the divorce, nobody wanted to cancel. The group included my ex-husband Mike, my father Earl, my brother-in-law Daryl, my sister Cheryl, and my uncle Jim. We were all experienced outdoors people who'd grown up hunting, fishing, and camping in the South. The main spot we picked was perfect for crawfishing, but Mike had heard from one of his buddies about this secluded lake, about an hour's boat ride from our campsite. According to his friend, this lake was absolutely teeming with massive blue catfish, the kind that make for legendary fishing stories. Everyone was excited about checking it out. We brought 2 aluminum flat-bottom boats that were perfect for navigating the shallow, flooded backwaters. But Mike had just bought a brand new bass boat 2 months earlier, his divorce present to himself, as he jokingly called it. It was completely impractical for where we were going, with its deep hull and powerful motor, but he insisted on bringing it anyway. Looking back, that's where our problem started. We spent the morning setting up camp and putting out crawfish traps. After lunch, Mike was itching to check out that catfish spot, and my dad was just as eager. So the 4 of us, me, Mike, Dad, and Daryl, decided to head out while Cheryl and Uncle Jim stayed behind to guard the camp and start prepping for dinner. It was around 2 p.m. when we set out in Mike's boat. April in Mississippi means the water is high from spring flooding, turning the bayou into this maze of half-submerged cypress trees. The scenery was beautiful in that eerie southern Gothic way, Spanish moss hanging from trees, the dark water reflecting the sky, snakes occasionally swimming alongside us. We navigated through areas where only the tops of trees were visible above the water. Dad kept saying we should have brought the aluminum boats, but Mike just cranked up his fancy sonar fish finder and pushed ahead. The trip took longer than expected. What was supposed to be an hour stretched into nearly 2, as Mike had to constantly slow down to navigate around submerged obstacles. When we finally reached the lake, I have to admit it was worth it. It was this pristine hidden gem that looked like nobody had fished it in years. We started casting lines right away, and sure enough, we were pulling in catfish like you wouldn't believe, big ones too, some over 20 pounds. We got so caught up in the fishing that we completely lost track of time. I remember looking up and suddenly realizing the sun was getting low. In April, it starts getting dark around 7 p.m. and my watch was showing nearly 6. "We need to head back," Dad said, reeling in his line. "We don't want to be navigating those flooded trees in the dark." Daryl agreed immediately. He'd been checking his watch for the past hour and had already packed up most of his gear. Mike was reluctant. He'd just hooked another big one, but finally agreed when Dad pointed out how quickly the light was fading. We packed up fast and headed back toward camp. We'd gone maybe 20 minutes when disaster struck. Mike was pushing the boat too fast, trying to make up for lost time, when we felt this horrible grinding sensation beneath us. The boat lurched forward, then stopped. "Shit!" Mike killed the engine immediately and jumped to the front of the boat to assess the damage. "We're stuck on a stump or something." We'd run aground on the muddy bottom, likely hitting a submerged tree in the process. The boat was wedged tight, and the propeller was half buried in mud. Mike jumped into the water, which came up to his waist. and tried pushing while Darrell tilted the motor up. I could see the panic starting to build in everyone's eyes as the sky grew darker. After about 20 minutes of struggling and sweating, we hadn't moved the boat an inch. Mike was covered in mud up to his chest, looking defeated. Darrell had stripped down to his underwear to help push, but it wasn't working. Dad sat on the edge of the boat thinking. "We need to lighten the load," he finally said. "Lisa, hand me that cooler." We started unloading everything we could, the cooler with our catch, tackle boxes, extra gear. Dad and I carefully placed everything on what looked like a partially submerged tree stump nearby. The boat lifted slightly but was still stuck. Mike climbed back in, exhausted, and we killed the engine completely to discuss our options. The silence that fell over us was heavy. No engine noise, no splashing from our efforts. Just the sound of dripping water, the occasional distant bird call, and our own breathing. That's when we heard it. At first it was so faint I thought I was imagining things. A soft splashing sound somewhere in the distance. Then it grew louder, unmistakable movement through water, deliberate, rhythmic. "You'll hear that," Darrell whispered, his body suddenly tense. We all nodded. The sound was coming from deeper in the swamp, from the direction we'd just come from. It wasn't the familiar sound of a deer wading through shallow water. I'd heard that 100 times before. This was heavier, purposeful. Splash, pause, splash, pause, like something big taking deliberate steps. "Probably just a deer," Mike said, but his voice cracked slightly. He didn't believe it himself. The splashing continued, getting closer. Whatever it was heading straight for us. Dad reached for his rifle. He never went into the backwoods without it, and nodded at Mike, who pulled out the 9mm he always kept in the boat. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the humid evening air. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice echoing across the water. "Anybody out there?" The splashing stopped immediately. Complete silence fell over everything. Even the insects seemed to go quiet. We all exchanged glances, and I remember the hair on my arms standing up. Mike called out again, louder this time. "We're armed. Identify yourself." Nothing. Then, after about 30 seconds of unbearable silence, the splashing started again. Only this time it wasn't cautious anymore. It was faster, determined, and definitely coming straight toward us. "What the hell?" Darrell whispered. Then we heard branches breaking. Thick branches, snapping like twigs. Whatever was coming was big, much bigger than a deer. A bear, maybe? But bears don't typically wade through swamp water toward humans, especially after being warned off. Dad, who'd been hunting these woods for over 50 years, looked more scared than I'd ever seen him. "That ain't right," he muttered. "That ain't normal." The splashing was getting closer, maybe 100 yards away now. In the fading light we could see movement in the water, ripples spreading between the trees, but couldn't make out what was causing it. Mike raised his gun. "Last warning," he shouted, his voice tight with fear. "I will shoot." The splashing paused again, just briefly, then continued. Whatever it wasn't afraid of us or our weapons. I remember thinking how unnatural that was. Every animal I knew, even predators, had a healthy fear of humans, especially armed ones making noise. Dad suddenly made a decision. Without saying a word, he slipped over the side of the boat into the waist-deep water and started pushing with a strength I didn't know he still had at 58. The boat shifted slightly. "Everyone push now!" he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. We all jumped in, me, Mike, and Darrell, and pushed with everything we had. I remember the mud squishing between my toes, the panic giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. The splashing sounds were maybe 50 yards away now, and I swear I could feel the water vibrating with each heavy step. The boat suddenly broke free with a sucking sound. Dad scrambled aboard first, then helped pull me up. Mike and Daryl practically threw themselves over the sides. Mike's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Mike didn't even wait to see if the propeller was clear before gunning it forward. The boat lurched, the propeller churning up mud, but we were moving. Behind us, the splashing sounds had picked up speed. "Don't look back," Dad said quietly but firmly. "Just keep going." We tore through the bayou at a dangerous speed, barely avoiding submerged trees. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the engine and our heavy breathing. It wasn't until we were about 15 minutes away that Mike finally eased off the throttle slightly, enough that we weren't in immediate danger of crashing. "What the hell was that?" Daryl finally asked, his voice small. "I don't know," Dad answered. He still had his rifle across his lap, finger near the trigger. "But it wasn't no deer, wasn't no bear, and sure as hell wasn't a person." "Could have been a gator," Mike suggested, but there was no conviction in his voice. "A gator doesn't break 4-inch branches," Dad replied, "and a gator stops when it hears humans. That thing came straight for us." We made it back to camp just as darkness fully set in. Cheryl and Uncle Jim were worried sick, having expected us back hours earlier. We told them what happened, and of course, they thought we were exaggerating or that fear had gotten the better of us. "Probably just a big old boar hog," Uncle Jim said. "They can make a racket in water," but he hadn't heard it. He hadn't felt the deliberate, intelligent way that thing moved toward us, undeterred by human voices and threats. We cut the trip short, packing up and leaving the next morning. None of us wanted to stay another night. We made up excuses, weather reports showing rain, urgent calls from work. But the truth was, none of us wanted to be there after dark again. For years afterward, we occasionally brought up the thing in the bayou when we got together. What's strange is that over time, our stories never changed or grew more dramatic, as tales often do. We all remembered the same details, the same unnatural feeling. My dad, who passed away in 2011, maintained until the end that in his 60-plus years of hunting and fishing in those swamps, he'd never encountered anything like what stalked us that day. I've done research over the years, looking into local folklore, trying to find explanations. The region has stories of strange creatures in the swamps, the Honey Island swamp monster and variations of the skunk ape. But most of those are dismissed as tall tales or misidentifications of known animals. What I know is this: whatever came toward us that April evening was deliberate. It wasn't afraid of humans, guns, or noise. It moved with purpose. And all 4 of us, experienced outdoors people who'd spent our lives in those woods, agreed that its behavior was completely inconsistent with any known animal in the region. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, feeling like I'm back in that boat as darkness falls, hearing those heavy, methodical splashes coming closer through the flooded trees. I've never gone back to Black Cypress Bayou, and I never will. The scariest part? Sometimes I wonder if it followed us out of there. On particularly dark nights, when rain is hitting the windows of my house, I could swear I hear that same deliberate splashing sound outside. A dodo story too. I've never really told this story outside my family because, well, who would believe me? But it's been eating at me for 25 years and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has seen something similar. I grew up in southern Iowa near Bloomfield, at the end of a dead-end gravel road. Our house was the last one. Beyond us was just rolling hills, creeks, and woods. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and not much ever happened. We had those clay hills covered with oak trees, maples, and cottonwoods down by the creeks. When I was a kid, there were still a bunch of abandoned farmhouses scattered around. Most people had switched to raising cattle by then. I was 10 at the time, June 17th, 1998. I remember the date because it was 2 days before my birthday, and I was thinking about the new bike my parents had hidden in the garage. I'd found it while looking for fishing tackle. That evening I'd ridden my old bike to my friend Eric's house about 2 miles away. We spent hours building a fort in his backyard, and I lost track of time. When I finally noticed the sun getting low, I knew I needed to head home fast. My dad had this rule: be home before dark or face consequences. The consequences usually involved extra chores for a week, and I really didn't want to spend my birthday week cleaning out the chicken coop. The road home was what we called a roller coaster road, all ups and downs along the hills. I was pumping the pedals hard, racing against the fading light. My legs burned, but I kept pushing. The thing about those roads is that you can't see what's on the other side of each rise until you're right on top of it. I remember everything about those moments so clearly. The way the cicadas were screaming from the trees, the sticky heat that made my t-shirt cling to my back, the reddish-orange glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the gravel. I could smell that earthy scent that rises from the ground on hot summer evenings, mixed with the sweet corn growing in the fields. I was about a mile from home, cresting one of those small hills, pedaling so hard the chain was making that clicking sound it does when you push too fast. And then suddenly, there it was, right in the middle of the road, not 20 feet ahead of me. I'd like to say I reacted quickly or did something brave, but the truth is, I panicked. I slammed on the brakes and jerked the handlebars hard to the left. My bike skidded on the loose gravel and went down. I tumbled off, scraping my elbow and knee pretty bad on the road, but I barely felt it because I couldn't take my eyes off what was standing there. It was tall, way taller than my dad, who's 6'2", maybe 7 or 8 feet. It's hard to judge height when you're terrified. It was covered in dark hair, not like fur exactly, more like really long human hair, but all over its body. The color was this deep brown, almost black, but with a reddish tint where the sunset hit it. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect from a wild animal. It hung straight and moved slightly in the breeze, but it was the face that really got me. It wasn't a monster face, not really. It looked almost human, but not quite. The forehead was sloped, with really pronounced brow ridges that shadowed its eyes. The nose was wide and flat, and the jaw was massive compared to a person's. And there was this hump or ridge between its shoulders, making it look slightly hunched forward. We just stared at each other. I'm not exaggerating when I say it seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. For maybe 3 or 4 seconds, though it felt like forever, neither of us moved. I was frozen in place, half lying on the gravel, with my bike tangled between my legs. It stood perfectly still except for its chest moving as it breathed. Then it blinked. It sounds stupid, but that blink broke the spell. Those eyes, they were dark, but definitely had whites like human eyes. They looked intelligent, aware, not like an animal at all. In one fluid motion, and this is what I still can't get over, it turned, bent its knees slightly, and jumped the fence at the side of the road. Not climbed, not scrambled over, jumped it. The fence was about 4 feet high, and it cleared it easily, landing with surprising grace for something so big. Then it was gone, disappearing into the cornfield beyond. The whole thing happened so fast that I almost wondered if I'd imagined it. But the scrapes on my arms and legs from the fall were real enough, and my bike chain had come off completely. It was lying in the dirt next to the rear wheel. I don't know how long I sat there in the road. Eventually, I realized it was getting darker by the minute, and whatever that thing was, it was out there somewhere. That thought got me moving. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't fix the chain, so I just picked up my bike and started running, pushing it alongside me. By the time I got home, I was completely out of breath, sweating like crazy, and probably looked like I'd seen a ghost. My mum was standing on the porch, that worried, angry look on her face that parents get when you're late. "David Allen Hopkins, do you have any idea what time?" she started, but stopped when she saw the state I was in. "What happened to you?" I tried to explain, but it came out in a jumble of words. "Thing, big road, jumped." I was hyperventilating, pointing back the way I'd come. Dad came out then, and they brought me inside. Mum cleaned up my scrapes, while Dad got me a glass of water. When I finally calmed down enough to speak properly, I told them everything, every detail about what I'd seen. They exchanged this look, the kind parents give each other when they're trying to decide how to handle something. Then Dad sat down next to me. "Son," he said in that serious voice, "you know Bill Young's farm down that way? He's been raising buffalo the past couple years. One of them probably got out somehow. It wasn't a buffalo." I remember almost shouting it. It was standing on 2 legs. It had a face, Dad. It jumped the fence. Mom put her hand on my shoulder. "You were riding fast. It was getting dark. You were worried about being late. Your mind could have played tricks on you." But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. It wasn't a buffalo or a bear or a man in a costume. It was something else entirely. They tried to convince me for days afterward. Dad even drove me down that road the next morning, pointing out where hoofprints had supposedly disturbed the gravel. But there weren't any buffalo out of their pen at the Young farm, and what he was showing me didn't look like what I remembered seeing in those moments after my fall. The worst part was when they suggested I'd made it up to avoid getting in trouble for being late. That hurt more than the scrapes and bruises from the fall. I'd never lied to them before, not about anything important. After a while, I stopped bringing it up. It was easier that way. But I started paying attention to the woods around our property in a way I never had before. I'd catch myself staring into the tree line, thinking I saw movement. I stopped riding my bike alone on that stretch of road. When friends talked about camping out, I'd make excuses. For years, I wondered if I was the only one who'd ever seen something like that around Bloomfield. Then one day when I was about 15, our neighbor Dick Hopkins, no relation, despite the same last name, came over to help Dad fix a tractor. They got to talking over beers after the work was done, and somehow the conversation turned to strange things they'd seen. Dick mentioned that his cousin had once seen something big walking on 2 legs near the creek that ran through his property, about 5 miles from our place. My ears perked up immediately, but I pretended to be focused on my homework at the kitchen table. Dad chuckled and said something about wild imaginations, and they moved on to talking about cattle prices. Later I tried to ask Dick about it, but he brushed it off. "Just an old story," he said, not meeting my eyes. But there was something in his voice that told me he believed his cousin. Over the years I've heard whispers of other sightings in the area. Nothing that made the news, just stories people tell in hushed voices when the conversation turns to the unexplained. Southern Iowa isn't known for Bigfoot sightings the way the Pacific Northwest is. But they happen. People just don't talk about them much. I'm 35 now, with a career and a life far away from those Iowa hills. But I still think about what happened that day. I've looked into Bigfoot reports, trying to find something that matches what I saw. The height, the hair, the pronounced ridge on the back. It all fits with what others have described. But that moment of mutual surprise, that look of intelligence in its eyes, that's what stays with me. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too, if it ever thinks about the skinny kid who crashed his bike because they startled each other on a quiet country road at sunset. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent 25 years trying to convince myself it was something else, a man, an animal, a product of an overactive imagination and the fading light. But I know what I saw. Last summer, I went back to visit my parents. They still live in the same house at the end of that dead-end road. One evening, I borrowed Dad's truck and drove down to where it happened. The road is paved now, but those same hills are there. The cornfields have given way to soybeans in some places, but it's still recognizable. I parked at the spot where I'd fallen and got out. Standing there in the summer twilight, cicadas singing just like they had been 25 years ago, I felt a chill despite the warm evening. I looked toward the fence line where it had disappeared. The fence is gone now, replaced by a new one a few feet over, but I could picture exactly how it had looked that day. As I stood there, I heard something moving in the brush beyond the field, probably just a deer or raccoon. But for a second, just a flash, I thought I saw something dark and tall moving between the trees at the edge of the property. I got back in the truck pretty quick after that. I don't know what I saw that day when I was 10. I don't know if I'll ever see anything like it again. But I know it was real, and I know I'm not the only one who's experienced something like this. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between what we know for sure and what we can't explain. All I know is that whenever I hear someone dismiss Bigfoot stories as hoaxes or misidentifications, I think about those intelligent eyes staring into mine on that Iowa road. And I wonder where it is now, and if there are others moving quietly through the forgotten places, just trying to avoid being seen. Story 3. I've kept this to myself for over 20 years, but I need to get it off my chest. Something happened to me and my friends back in the summer of '99 that I still can't explain. And honestly, it still freaks me out when I think about it too much. It was June 4th, 1999, the first Friday after school let out for summer. Me and my 3 best friends, Chris, Ryan and Derek, were all 14, freshmen in high school, and beyond excited for 3 months of freedom. We'd been planning this campout for weeks, ever since the weather started getting nice. My family had about 4 acres backing up to a huge patch of timber in Dallas County, maybe 10-15 miles west of Des Moines. Not exactly the middle of nowhere, but far enough from the city lights that you could actually see stars at night. My parents were pretty cool about letting us camp in the backyard. We'd done it dozens of times before, but this time we convinced them to let us hike about a quarter mile into the woods to a small clearing we'd found while exploring earlier that spring. My dad helped us carry our stuff out there. A 4-person tent, sleeping bags, a cooler with hot dogs and sodas, and all the other camping essentials. He showed us how to dig a small fire pit and clear the area of leaves and sticks so we wouldn't accidentally start a forest fire. "You boys keep your cell phones on and call the house if you need anything," he told us before heading back. This was 1999, so our phones were those Nokia bricks that barely got reception in town, let alone the woods. But we nodded and promised anyway. The afternoon was perfect. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and spent a couple hours just messing around, climbing trees, throwing sticks at each other, talking about which girls from school we thought were hot. Normal 14-year-old boy stuff. Around sunset, we got our fire going and roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. Chris had snuck a Playboy from his older brother's room, so we passed that around while stuffing our faces with chips, candy, and the fruit my mum had insisted we bring: apples, bananas, and a container of strawberries. We stayed up until maybe midnight, telling ghost stories and talking about what we wanted to do over the summer. The woods were alive with normal nighttime sounds. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, leaves rustling in the light breeze. Nothing unusual. Eventually, we got tired and crawled into our tent. I remember Ryan farting, which caused a solid 5 minutes of laughing and punching before we all settled down and fell asleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch was somewhere in the pile of our stuff, and this was before smartphones with built-in clocks. But it was that deep, dark part of night when everything feels still. At first I thought I needed to pee, but then I realized what had actually woken me. A sound outside our tent. It wasn't subtle. It sounded like something was moving around our campsite. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. I figured it was probably just a raccoon going through our trash bag, which we'd stupidly left outside instead of hanging in a tree like my dad had suggested. I was about to roll over and try to go back to sleep when I heard Derek whisper, "You guys hear that?" "Yeah," Chris whispered back, "probably just a raccoon." Then the sounds changed. Whatever was out there started making this weird noise, like a low, guttural grunt. It reminded me of when we'd visited my uncle's farm and heard his sick cow moaning in the barn. But this was deeper, almost, I don't know, sadder. And there was this heavy, raspy breathing that didn't sound like any animal I knew. "That's not a raccoon," Ryan whispered, and I could hear the fear in his voice. Then it hit us, this overwhelming smell. I've never smelled anything like it before or since. It was like rotten eggs and garbage and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. "Someone's messing with us," Chris said, a little louder now. "It's probably those jerks from the baseball team." That made sense. The seniors were known for hazing underclassmen, and though we hadn't experienced it personally yet, we'd heard stories. Maybe they followed us out here and were trying to scare us. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We all agreed to peek outside. Derek, who was closest to the zipper, slowly started to open the tent. As soon as the zipper made noise, the rustling outside stopped. The breathing slowed, like whatever was out there was listening, waiting. That should have been our first clue that this wasn't some high school prank. Anyone trying to scare us would have either run away or jumped at the tent when they heard us moving. Derek hesitated with the zipper half open. None of us wanted to be the first to look outside. "Just do it," I whispered, and he pulled the zipper the rest of the way. The four of us poked our heads out of the tent opening. Our campfire had died down to embers, casting just enough dull red light to see the immediate area around our camp. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was something. In the dim light, I could make out a large figure moving away from our campsite. My first thought was bear, but we don't have bears in central Iowa. And this thing was walking on two legs. It was tall, really tall. There was a sycamore tree near where it was standing that I knew was about 30 feet high. This thing's head reached almost a third of the way up that tree, so maybe 7 feet tall, maybe more. The most obvious feature was the hair or fur that covered its body. In the faint red glow from our dying fire, it looked dark, reddish-brown. The hair was long and shaggy, especially around its shoulders and back. It was moving away from us, but turned slightly, and for just a second I caught a glimpse of its profile. I couldn't see facial features clearly, but the shape was wrong for a human. The head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders with almost no neck, and the proportions were all off. Massive shoulders, long arms that hung down past where a person's knees would be. We all froze. Nobody said a word. The thing paused, too, as if sensing us watching it. Then it moved surprisingly quickly, disappearing into the thicker trees with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. For what felt like forever, we just sat there, half in and half out of the tent, staring at the spot where it had vanished. The smell lingered, but was already fading. "Did you guys see that?" Ryan finally whispered. We all nodded. "What the hell was it?" Chris asked, his voice shaking. "A person in a costume," Derek suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "No way," I said. "Did you see how big it was? How it moved?" We crawled fully out of the tent and huddled together next to the remains of our fire. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were, but I could feel Ryan trembling next to me. "Could it have been a bear?" Chris asked. "Bears don't walk on two legs like that," I said. "And there aren't any bears around here anyway." "Maybe it was Bigfoot," Ryan said, trying to laugh but failing. "The thing is, as ridiculous as it sounds, that's exactly what I was thinking. I'd seen those cheesy Finding Bigfoot TV specials and read about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. But Iowa, it seemed impossible. Whatever it was, it seemed scared of us," Derek pointed out. "It ran away as soon as we saw it." That was true, and somehow made me feel a little better. If it had wanted to hurt us, it had every opportunity while we were sleeping. We debated what to do next. It was still the middle of the night, probably 3 or 4 a.m., None of us wanted to try hiking back to my house in the dark, especially knowing that thing was somewhere in these woods, but staying put didn't feel great either. In the end, we decided to rebuild the fire. We gathered as much wood as we could find without venturing too far from camp, piled it on, and got a decent blaze going. None of us were going back to sleep anyway. As we sat around the fire, we compared notes on what we'd seen. It was weird. We all described basically the same thing, but with small differences. Chris thought its fur was more black than brown. Ryan swore he saw glowing eyes, though none of the rest of us had noticed that. Derek thought it had been carrying something, maybe one of our apples from the food bag. That's when we checked our stuff and realized our fruit was gone. The bag had been sitting on a log near the edge of our camp, and now it was empty. Not torn or destroyed, just empty, like something had carefully picked out all the fruit and left the bag. "It came for the food," I said. "It smelled the fruit and came to check it out. We just scared each other." That explanation made sense, and we latched onto it because it was less terrifying than the alternatives, just a hungry animal looking for an easy meal. Nothing supernatural or impossible about that, right? But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew what I'd seen wasn't any animal native to Iowa. No known animal anyway. We stayed awake until dawn, keeping the fire blazing and talking in low voices. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, we packed up our stuff and practically ran back to my house. My parents were surprised to see us so early, but assumed we just got cold or uncomfortable sleeping on the ground. We didn't tell them what happened. We didn't tell anyone. We made a pact right there in my backyard. This stays between us. Who would believe us anyway? We'd sound crazy. For weeks afterward, we'd get together and talk about it, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We looked up all kinds of animals native to Iowa, but nothing matched. We even checked out books on cryptids and mythological creatures from the library, earning some weird looks from the librarian. The closest match was always Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those were supposed to be in the Pacific Northwest or Canada, not Iowa. And yet, what we saw matched so many of the descriptions. The height, the reddish-brown fur, the way it moved, even the sulfur smell that so many reports mentioned. That summer changed us. We didn't go camping again, not in those woods. Chris's family moved to Minnesota the following year, and we gradually lost touch. Ryan and Derek and I stayed friends through high school, but we rarely talked about that night. It was like this weird shared secret that we all carried but couldn't fully process. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some homeless person wrapped in furs or blankets. Maybe it was a large man in hunting gear. Maybe it was just shadows and our overactive teenage imaginations turning a deer or some other animal into something more sinister. But deep down, I know what I saw. We all saw it. Something that shouldn't exist, at least not in the woods of central Iowa. I'm 38 now, with kids of my own. Sometimes, when my son asks to go camping, I get a flash of that night. The smell, the sound of heavy breathing, the sight of that massive figure disappearing into the trees. I always make excuses about why we should camp in state parks rather than remote woods. I've never gone back to those specific woods. My parents sold that house years ago, but sometimes I'm tempted to drive out there to see if the clearing is still there, to look for, I don't know what. Evidence, closure. I've seen all the TV shows, read the online forums, heard all the theories about Bigfoot and other cryptids. Most of it seems like garbage, hoaxes, misidentifications, or just plain fiction. But then I remember what I saw, what we all saw, and I'm not so sure anymore. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days when I don't believe myself. But I know what I experienced that night in the summer of '99, and nothing has ever convinced me it wasn't real. Whatever that thing was, it was out there in those woods. Maybe it still is. And sometimes, when I smell sulfur or hear rustling leaves on a dark night, part of me is right back in that tent, 14 years old, listening to something inhuman moving just outside. dear. Story 4. I've been going over what happened that night for 17 years now, and I still don't have any logical explanation for what I saw. Maybe writing it down will help make sense of it, or at least let someone else confirm I'm not crazy. It was October 22nd, 2006. I remember the date exactly because my brother Mike had just gotten back from a work trip on the 21st, and we'd planned this fishing trip for weeks. The three of us, me, Larry, Mike, and our buddy Dave, headed out to the Wapsipin River near Follett's in Clinton County, Iowa. Everyone around here just calls it the Wapsi. We've been fishing there since we were kids, so it wasn't anything special for us. Just three guys in their 30s trying to catch some catfish and drink a few beers. We arrived around 5:30 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set. It was cold as hell, about 35 degrees, and we knew it would drop even more once night fell completely. The Wapsi isn't exactly a tourist destination. It's pretty much just farmland with cornfields stretching in every direction, and there are these old fruit-bearing trees that line parts of the riverbank. In October, most of the trees were pretty bare, but there were still some crab apples and wild pears scattered around. We parked Mike's truck about a quarter-mile from our spot and hiked in with our gear. I brought my old Coleman lantern, some extra propane, my tackle box, and 2 fishing rods. Mike and Dave had similar setups, plus Dave brought this fancy new headlamp he wanted to show off. Mike carried the cooler with our beers and sandwiches, complaining the whole way about his back. Our spot was this small clearing about 20 feet from the riverbank. The river itself isn't huge, maybe 100 feet across at that point. The opposite bank rises up a bit into some dense woods that eventually connect to Old Man Gunderson's property, though nobody goes there much since he died. We set up our shorelines for catfish, using these little bells that would ring if we got a bite. Dave was using chicken liver for bait, while Mike and I stuck with our usual night crawlers. After we got the lines in, we built a decent-sized fire using fallen branches and some logs I'd brought in the truck. The fire was absolutely necessary, not just for light, but because the temperature was dropping fast. By 7:30 it was completely dark, except for our fire and the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds. We'd each caught 1 decent-sized catfish, which we were saving in a bucket for cleaning later. The fish weren't really biting much, but that was normal for late October. We weren't there just for the fish anyway. We were sitting around the fire, drinking beer and bullshitting about work when I first heard it. It was around 8:15 p.m., and at first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, or maybe the river current hitting some rocks. But then I heard it again, a distinct sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush across the river. I didn't say anything at first, thinking it was probably just a deer or maybe a farmer's cow that had wandered off. "You guys hear that?" I finally asked, after hearing the sound a third time. Mike was in the middle of telling some story about his boss and just shrugged. "Probably raccoons. They're all over here." Dave nodded in agreement. "Or beavers. I saw some beaver dams upstream last time I was here." But I knew the sounds of raccoons and beavers. Hell, I'd been fishing and hunting in these parts my whole life. This was something bigger, much bigger. The sound was like heavy footsteps, branches breaking under significant weight. Raccoons and beavers don't make that kind of noise, and possums are practically silent. I listened more intently while Mike continued his story. Dave was laughing, but I couldn't focus on their conversation anymore. I heard more rustling across the river, and now there was something else, a sound almost like grunting. Not pig-like, but deeper, more guttural. I stood up and walked away from the fire. Mike called after me, "Where you going, Larry? Got to take a leak?" "Just checking something," I said, moving toward the riverbank. "You guys keep talking." I needed to get away from the firelight to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. Standing at the edge of the river, I stared across at the opposite bank. The moon was partially covered by clouds, but there was enough light to make out the tree line and the basic shape of the landscape. That's when I saw it. At first, It was just movement, something large shifting between the trees. But as my eyes adjusted better, I could make out a figure, not a human figure, not any animal I recognized either. This thing was enormous. It was moving around at the edge of the trees and seemed to be reaching up to the branches of one of the fruit trees, like it was picking something. Standing upright, on two legs. I estimated it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and the mass of it, easily over 300 pounds. It had a silhouette that was unmistakably not human, with massive shoulders and what looked like hair or fur covering its entire body. I stood frozen, watching it for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. The weird thing was, I wasn't scared. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt fascinated, completely captivated by what I was seeing. I had this overwhelming sense that I was witnessing something rare and incredible. When it moved to another tree, I finally snapped out of it and quietly made my way back to the fire. "Guys," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's something across the river, something big." Dave laughed. "What, like a bear?" "There haven't been bears in this part of Iowa for 100 years. "Not a bear," I said. "Something else. Come look." Mike must have heard something in my voice, because he put down his beer and stood up. Dave followed, still smirking like I was pulling his leg. We walked quietly to the riverbank, and I pointed across to where I'd seen the figure. It was still there, still moving between trees, seemingly unaware of our presence. "I don't see anything," Dave whispered. "Look at the tallest tree, about 50 feet in from the bank," I said. "It's moving around it now." Mike squinted. "I think I see something moving, but it's too dark to tell what it is." "I've got my flashlight," I said, pulling out my heavy maglite. Without thinking too much about it, I clicked it on and pointed the beam across the river. The light hit it directly, and for 3 or 4 seconds we all saw it clearly. It was exactly as tall as I'd thought, at least 7 feet. It was covered in dark hair or fur, with longer hair hanging from its arms. The face was hard to make out from that distance, but I could see that it wasn't human, not even close. The proportions were all wrong, arms too long, shoulders too wide, head shaped differently. The moment my light hit it, the creature froze, looking directly at us. Then, with shocking speed for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the woods. Not running exactly, but moving with this weird, fluid grace that didn't seem possible for its size. "What the fuck was that?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking a little. Dave was silent for several seconds, then laughed nervously. "Come on, guys. That's obviously someone in a costume. Someone's screwing with us." "In 35-degree weather, in the middle of nowhere, at night?" I asked. "Who would do that?" "I don't know. Maybe some local kids? Or someone who followed us from town," Dave suggested. But he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. Mike was still staring across the river. "That didn't move like a person in a costume, Dave." We stood there for several more minutes, shining the light into the woods, but there was no sign of the creature. Finally, we went back to the fire. None of us felt like fishing anymore. "It had to be a Bigfoot," I said finally, saying out loud what I'd been thinking. "What else could it be?" Dave snorted. "A Bigfoot in Iowa? Come on, Larry." "What would you call it then?" I asked. "I don't know," Dave admitted. "But Bigfoot isn't real. Everyone knows that." Mike was unusually quiet. My brother isn't the type to believe in this kind of stuff, but he also isn't the type to dismiss something he saw with his own eyes. "I don't know what it was," he said finally, "but it was something." We tried to go back to normal after that, but the mood had completely changed. I kept looking across the river, hoping for another glimpse. Dave kept trying to come up with rational explanations, each one more far-fetched than the last. Mike just drank his beer and stared into the fire. About an hour later, I realized something else strange. "Listen," I said. "To what?" Dave asked. "Exactly. There's nothing to hear." The woods were completely silent. No owls hooting, no raccoons chittering, no frogs croaking by the riverbank, nothing. The only sound was the crackling of our fire and the faint rush of the river. "Animals go quiet sometimes," Dave said, but he sounded uneasy. "Not like this," I replied. "Not everything at once." The silence continued for the rest of the night. We stayed until about 2 a.m., mostly because none of us wanted to admit how unsettled we were. When we finally packed up to leave, I found myself hurrying a bit, constantly glancing across the river or over my shoulder. Walking back to the truck, Mike finally spoke about what we'd seen. "Whatever it was, let's keep it between us, okay? People will think we're crazy." Dave nodded quickly. "Agreed. It was probably nothing anyway. A bear or a guy in a costume or something." But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't a bear or a person in a costume. The way it moved, its size, the complete silence of the forest after it disappeared, all of it pointed to something not normal. The next morning I considered going back to look for tracks on the opposite bank, but there was no easy way to cross the river without a boat. The nearest bridge was miles away, and even if I got to the other side, I wasn't sure I could find the exact spot where the creature had been. It's been 17 years since that night, and I've never told this story to anyone outside of Mike and Dave. Mike rarely mentions it, and when he does, he's vague about what we saw. Dave has convinced himself it was some local playing a prank, though he can never explain who would do such a thing or why. But I know what I saw. I've gone back to that spot on the Wapsi many times since then, always hoping for another glimpse, but always coming home disappointed. Sometimes, though, when I'm sitting by the river at dusk, I hear something moving in the woods across the water, and the forest goes completely silent. I don't know if it was actually a Bigfoot I saw that night. I don't know if such creatures really exist. But I know what I saw wasn't human, wasn't any normal animal, and wasn't my imagination. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there in the woods along the Wapsi, watching and waiting for something only it understands. Story 5. I've been debating whether to post this for months now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anybody of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been driving me crazy, and I figured if anyone would understand, it would be people here. This happened back on August 29th, 2019. My wife, Eleanor, and I were on our way back from Alaska in our motorhome. We'd been planning this trip for years, 9,506 miles total, when it was all said and done. We'd seen some amazing things, glaciers, wildlife, mountains that made you feel tiny, but nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared us for what we saw that day. It was around 10 a.m., clear skies, perfect visibility. We were driving south on Highway 37 in northwest British Columbia, just past the Nass River Bridge. If you've never been there, it's about as remote as it gets. Dense forest on both sides of a 2-lane highway. The only sign of humans was this construction mustering site we'd passed maybe a mile back. Eleanor was reading a guidebook in the passenger seat while I drove. I remember feeling pretty good that morning. We'd had a great breakfast at this little place in Stewart before heading out, and the scenery was beautiful. I kept the motor home at a steady 55 mph. Those roads aren't exactly the place to be speeding, especially in something as bulky as our 28-foot Winnebago. That's when it happened. From the right side of the road, the east side, something emerged from the tree line. At first, my brain tried to process it as a bear, but no, this thing was walking upright. Then I thought maybe it was a person in a coat. But as it moved into full view, crossing directly in front of us, I knew immediately this wasn't human. "Elle, are you seeing this?" I said, my voice cracking. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Eleanor dropped her book. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, Mark." This creature was striding across the highway with purpose. It never hesitated, never looked our way or checked for traffic. It just walked, no, strode, across both lanes as if it owned them. From our elevated position in the motorhome cab, we had a perfect view. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. It was covered head to toe in dark brown hair, not black, but a deep chocolate brown that looked almost reddish where the sun hit it. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect. It hung in a way that seemed natural, I guess. It walked almost completely upright, not hunched over like a gorilla. Its arms were longer than a human's, swinging naturally with each step. The chest was flat, definitely male. Its strides were broad and confident. Each footfall seemed deliberate, powerful. I remember thinking it moved with this strange grace that shouldn't be possible for something so large. I slowed down instinctively, but we were still moving at a good clip when it crossed our path. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 4 to 5 seconds, but in those seconds I saw something that has changed me forever. The face, I only caught it in profile as it crossed, had a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flatter nose than a human. Not ape-like exactly, but definitely not human either, something in between. Without breaking stride, it disappeared into the forest on the west side of the highway. My immediate instinct was to stop. I wanted desperately to pull over, to try to see where it went, maybe even follow it. But Highway 37 is narrow there, with no real shoulder to speak of, and these massive logging trucks were barreling down the road every few minutes. There was literally nowhere safe to stop. "Did you see that?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I said, my mouth dry. "I saw it. That wasn't a bear. Or a person. No, it wasn't." We drove in silence for the next 20 minutes, both of us processing. Eleanor finally broke the silence. "It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" she said. I nodded. "I think so, yes. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life. I've hunted, fished, and hiked across North America. I know what bears look like when they stand up. I know what a person in a ghillie suit looks like. This wasn't either of those things. What we saw matches what people call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I've never been a believer or a skeptic before this. I just never gave it much thought. But now, I'm certain these creatures exist, because I saw one with my own eyes, in broad daylight, from less than 30 yards away. We kept driving south, periodically looking at each other as if to confirm that what happened was real. I couldn't stop replaying the image in my head. The fluid movement, the confidence in its stride, the sheer size of the thing. Around noon, we stopped at a small diner about 60 miles south of our sighting. I was still shaking slightly when I tried to eat my sandwich. Eleanor seemed calmer, but I could tell she was processing it too. "We should tell someone," she said. "Who?" I asked. "The local police." "Excuse me, officer, we'd like to report a Sasquatch crossing the highway." She shrugged. "I don't know. There must be researchers or someone who documents these things." I felt a slight hesitation. Not because I doubted what we saw, but because I worried about not being taken seriously, about being lumped in with the conspiracy theorists and attention seekers. We got back on the road, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying those few seconds over and over. I found myself getting angry that I hadn't installed a dash cam before our trip. We'd discussed getting one for the Alaska journey, but I decided it wasn't necessary. Now I was kicking myself. We could have had actual footage, undeniable evidence. That night, we stayed at a campground near Prince George. I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature crossing the road, the confident stride, the muscular frame, the way it never acknowledged our presence but just continued on its way. Eleanor slept fine, which honestly annoyed me a bit. How could she sleep after what we'd seen? But that's Elle for you, always the practical one. She saw it, she processed it, and she moved on. Meanwhile, I was lying awake at 3 a.m., questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. The next morning over coffee, we talked about it again. Our descriptions matched exactly. The height, the coloring, the movement, everything. We hadn't influenced each other's recollections. We had both seen the same thing. You know what it reminded me of? Eleanor said. That old film, the Patterson-Gimlin film. When we got home the following week, I looked it up. She was right. What we saw looked remarkably similar to the subject in that famous 1967 footage. The proportions, the gait, everything. Except we saw it in profile the entire time, never from behind. Over the next few months, I did a deep dive into Sasquatch research. I learned that the area where we had our sighting, northwest BC near the Nass River, has a history of similar reports. The indigenous peoples of that region have stories about these beings going back centuries. I found myself obsessing over maps of the area, trying to pinpoint the exact location. I even contacted a wildlife biologist who specializes in large mammals in the Pacific Northwest. He listened politely, but suggested what we might have seen was a bear with mange or some other condition that made it look different. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear. The thing that strikes me most looking back is how mundane the crossing was for the creature. It wasn't running away from something or acting strangely. It was just traveling. Going from one place to another through territory it knew well. We were the interlopers, not it. In October, about 2 months after our sighting, I finally worked up the courage to submit a report to one of those Bigfoot research organizations. I was meticulous with the details, the location, time of day, weather conditions, our vantage point, everything. They asked for sketches, which I provided to the best of my ability. The researcher I spoke with on the phone seemed genuinely interested. He told me they'd had other reports from that general area over the years. He didn't treat me like I was crazy or making things up, which I appreciated, but here's the thing that still haunts me. As convincing as our sighting was to us, it's just another story to everyone else. Without photographic evidence, it's just 2 more people claiming they saw something impossible. I've thought about going back. Eleanor thinks I'm obsessed, and maybe I am. But how do you just move on with your normal life after seeing something that fundamentally shifts your understanding of what's possible? Spring turned to summer, and I found myself planning another trip to British Columbia. Eleanor refused to go. "Mark, lightning doesn't strike twice," she said. "And even if it did, what's your plan? To sit on Highway 37 for weeks, hoping it crosses again?" She was right, of course, but that doesn't stop me from thinking about it. It's been over a year now since that morning on Highway 37. I still think about it almost daily. The image is seared into my memory, this massive hair-covered being with its purposeful stride and long swinging arms, crossing the highway as if it were just another day. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not trying to convince the world that Sasquatch exists. I know what I saw. Eleanor knows what she saw. That's enough for us. But I will say this. The next time we take the motorhome on a long trip, we're absolutely getting a dash cam, because you never know what might cross your path in the wilderness of British Columbia. And if you're driving Highway 37 south of the Nass River Bridge, keep your eyes open. Maybe slow down a bit. Look to the forests on either side, because there's something out there, something that most people believe is just a myth, something that crosses highways in broad daylight without a care in the world, something that I saw with my own eyes and will never forget as long as I live. Story 6. I still can't believe what happened to me last month. My hands are shaking just typing this out, but I need to share it with people who might understand. I'm a 52-year-old archaeologist from Sweden, and I've been fascinated with Bigfoot for years. I finally saved enough money to join a BFRO expedition in British Columbia. A dream come true for me. We spent 4 incredible days in the wilderness around Harrison Hot Springs, searching for evidence. While we found some interesting footprints and heard some strange vocalizations at night, nothing prepared me for what happened on our way back. It was September 12th, around 3:30 in the afternoon. We were heading back to Vancouver in 2 vehicles, and I was riding in the second car with 3 other team members. The weather was typical Pacific Northwest, slightly overcast, but still good visibility. We were on this remote stretch called Morse Valley Road, approaching a small bridge over Weaver Creek. There was a 12-kilometer marker sign nearby. I wasn't even looking for anything at this point. We were all tired, chatting about the expedition, thinking about hot showers and real beds. Then something caught my eye on the left side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a bush moving in the wind or maybe a deer. I turned my head, and there it was. My heart literally stopped. About 40 meters from our car, moving quickly from a drainage trench toward a line of trees, was a figure I'll never forget. Not a person, not an animal I recognized. It was bipedal, reddish-brown, moving with this weird, fluid grace that no human could match. Then it just froze, like it suddenly realized it was exposed. The body went completely still, but its head, its head, slowly turned to track our car as we drove past. That's when I made eye contact with it. It only lasted maybe 2-3 seconds, but time seemed to stretch out forever. The eyes were deep-set, dark, but unmistakably intelligent. There was something so unsettling about them, not just animal fear, but a calculating awareness. The Swedish word apalapa, meaning ape, popped into my head instantly. It wasn't random panic. My brain was trying to categorize what I was seeing. The creature looked worried, tense, like it knew it had made a mistake being seen. It wasn't relaxed or casual. It was assessing the danger we presented. I'm convinced it was male, though I can't tell you exactly why. No obvious female characteristics, just something in its build and proportions. It stood about my height. I'm 6'3", but was leaner than what you see in the Patterson film. Not skinny, but not bulky either. Just efficiently built. The hair covering its body was short, reddish-brown, almost like an orangutan, but not as long or shaggy. The face is what I can't get out of my mind. It wasn't fully ape, wasn't fully human. The closest comparison I can make is to reconstructions of Australopithecus africanus, but with a higher forehead. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist, an evolutionary branch that was supposed to be extinct. And then we were past it, just like that. The most frustrating part, I froze, completely froze. I had 3 cameras in my backpack, a good knife, bear spray, even a small tomahawk for clearing brush. I was literally prepared for this exact moment for years. And what did I do? Nothing. I didn't say a word, didn't ask the driver to stop, didn't even point. My mouth went dry, my muscles locked up, and I just stared as we drove away. When we finally reached Vancouver that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to act normal during dinner, but I was barely present. Finally, I pulled Jason, another team member, aside and told him what happened. He got really quiet, then told me something that gave me chills. Apparently, a BFRO investigator named Bill Miller had documented an almost identical sighting years earlier. An Italian tourist had seen something at that exact same location. That's when the regret really hit me. I'd had a chance to document something extraordinary, and I'd blown it. I couldn't sleep that night, kept seeing those eyes watching me. By morning, I'd made up my mind. 2 days later, I rented a car and drove back to that stretch of road alone. Probably the stupidest decision of my life, but I had to know. Had to see if there was any evidence left. I've never been so terrified. Every noise in the forest made me jump. I kept the bear spray in my hand the entire time, safety off, finger on the trigger. I spent hours searching both sides of the road where I'd seen the creature. The area was beautiful but eerie. Thick forest with moss-covered ground, that bridge crossing over a pristine stream that flows eventually into Harrison Lake. I found something on my second day of searching. On the mossy ground on both sides of the road were what looked like massive footprints. Not as clear as I'd hoped, no toe definitions or anything I could cast, but definite compressions in the moss that were way too big for any human. And nearby I found deer tracks, lots of them. It made me wonder if the Sasquatch had been tracking deer when we interrupted it. Standing there, I suddenly remembered something the late researcher John Green had written about Sasquatch habitat preferences: forest, fresh water, and abundant deer. This location had all three. It was perfect. When I returned to my hotel that night, I couldn't stop shaking. Part of me wanted to go back with better equipment, maybe set up a blind and wait. But another part of me, the primitive, instinctual part, knew that would be dangerous. Those eyes hadn't been friendly. They'd been assessing, calculating. It's been a month now, and I still can't explain why I didn't speak up when it happened. It's like my brain short-circuited, some primal fear response taking over. I've spent my career studying human ancestors, but nothing prepared me for coming face to face with something that challenges everything I know about evolution and survival. I've told a few colleagues, but I can see the skepticism in their faces. They think I saw a bear standing up, or a person in the woods, or that I was tired and my mind played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. Those eyes knew I saw it too. I'm going back next summer. Better prepared this time, but even as I make these plans, something nags at me, that look of intelligence in its eyes. What if these creatures don't want to be found? What if they've survived all this time precisely because they're smart enough to avoid us? And what happens if one decides you've gotten too close? I keep having this recurring nightmare where I'm back on that road, but I'm alone and on foot. I hear something moving through the trees behind me, but when I turn around there's nothing there. Then I feel hot breath on the back of my neck and wake up in a cold sweat. I'm not some crazy person looking for attention. I'm a scientist with a reputation to protect. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't human, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist according to mainstream science. I've spent my life studying the past, digging up evidence of creatures long extinct. Now I can't stop thinking about what else might be out there, hiding just beyond the edge of our awareness. Things that watch us from the trees, with eyes that understand exactly what we are and the threat we represent. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain what happened that day. All I know is that for a few seconds, I looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, something that has managed to remain hidden despite all our technology and expansion. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's looking for me too. The scariest part. That spot where I saw it is only about 2 hours from Vancouver, one of Canada's biggest cities. How many other people have driven past that same spot, never knowing what was watching them from the trees? How many hikers and campers have pitched their tents, thinking they were alone in the wilderness? I check the BFRO database almost daily now, looking for new reports from that area. And I keep wondering, was it just passing through, or does it live there? Does it have a family? Are there more of them? I don't have answers, just questions that keep me up at night. And those eyes, those intelligent, calculating eyes that knew exactly what I was. Story 7. I've been reluctant to share this for a long time, 15 years in fact. But I can't keep it bottled up anymore, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it. I was hunting elk in the Whiteswood Lake area near Canal Flats, British Columbia back in September 2007. I remember it was a crisp autumn day, probably around 45 degrees. Perfect hunting weather. I'd been tracking a small herd since dawn, moving slowly through the dense forest, carefully watching for any signs. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered about 7 miles of rough terrain and decided to take a break. I found a fallen tree that made a decent spot to sit, and I remember thinking how quiet it was. You know, that kind of forest quiet where you can almost hear your own heartbeat? I dug into my jacket pocket and pulled out a Snickers bar. I know it sounds stupid, but I always bring chocolate when I hunt. It's been my little tradition since my dad took me on my first hunt when I was 12. I've been hunting these woods for 35 years. I know every sound, every smell, every animal in these parts. I've encountered black bears, grizzlies, cougars, you name it. I respect the wilderness and its inhabitants, and I'd like to think they respect me too, or at least we understand each other. So there I was, just sitting on this log, halfway through my chocolate bar when it hit me. The smell. Jesus Christ, the smell. I've field-dressed hundreds of animals. I've come across week-old bear kills. I've even had the misfortune of finding human remains once during a search and rescue operation. But this was different. It was so sudden and overwhelming that I actually gagged. Imagine the worst case of wet dog you've ever smelled, then mix it with rotting meat that's been sitting in the sun for days. And there was something else to it, something I still can't quite describe, almost chemical or metallic. The smell was so dense, so physical, it felt like it was coating the inside of my nose and throat. My first thought was that I must be downwind from a bear's kill site, or maybe even a bear itself. But this was worse than any bear I'd ever encountered. Hell, it was worse than a skunk spray at point-blank range. My eyes actually watered. I instinctively looked upwind to try to locate the source. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by a stand of pine trees, something was standing completely still. At first, my brain tried to make it into something familiar, a bear standing on its hind legs maybe, or just a weird shadow created by the trees. But as my eyes focused, I realized it was neither. It was tall, really tall. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. It was covered in dark brown hair or fur, not shaggy like a bear's, but more uniform, almost like a short-haired dog. But it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. The creature was standing on 2 legs, completely upright like a human. Its proportions were all wrong, though. Massive shoulders, long arms that hung down past where its knees would be. I couldn't make out its face clearly through the trees and the distance, but I could tell it had a somewhat flattened face, not protruding like a bear's snout. The most unsettling thing was how perfectly still it stood. Not the alertness of a deer that's caught your scent, or the aggressive posture of a bear. It was just watching. No movement whatsoever. I couldn't even tell if it was breathing. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, we just stayed like that. Me, frozen on my log, chocolate bar forgotten in my hand, and this thing, standing motionless in the trees. I didn't feel threatened exactly. I know what a predator's stare feels like, and this wasn't it. It was more like curiosity, assessment. I really don't know. My rifle was leaning against the log next to me. I've handled firearms my entire adult life, and reaching for it was pure instinct. I glanced down for a split second, I swear it couldn't have been more than a blink, to grab my rifle. When I looked back up, it was gone, just gone. No sound of retreating footsteps, no rustling branches, no sign it had ever been there at all. And the smell, it vanished just as suddenly as it had appeared, like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second the air was thick with that putrid stench, and the next it was just the clean pine scent of the forest again. I sat there for another minute, rifle now clutched in my hands, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Not even a bird call broke the silence. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I got up slowly, keeping my rifle ready, and cautiously moved toward where the creature had been standing. The ground was covered in pine needles and soft earth, perfect for tracking. But there were no tracks, no broken branches, no hair caught on the bark, nothing to indicate anything had been standing there just moments before. I'm not a man who spooks easily. I've been lost in these woods overnight in the dead of winter. I've had a grizzly charge me once. Thankfully, it was just a bluff. I've been caught in sudden storms that came out of nowhere. The wilderness can be dangerous and unpredictable, but I've always prided myself on keeping a level head. But this shook me to my core. It defied everything I knew about the woods and the creatures that inhabit them. Animals leave tracks. They make noise when they move. They don't just disappear into thin air. I abandoned my hunt and headed back to my truck. The entire way back I felt like I was being watched. I kept scanning the trees, kept my rifle ready, but I didn't see or smell anything unusual again. When I got back to town, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen some kind of monster in the woods? That it had vanished into thin air? They'd think I was drunk or crazy. A few weeks later, I heard about a researcher named Blaine McMillan who was investigating unusual wildlife encounters in the area. Against my better judgment, I contacted him and told him what I'd seen. I expected ridicule, but instead, he listened intently, asked thoughtful questions and took detailed notes. He asked me about the smell specifically, how sudden its onset and disappearance had been. He seemed particularly interested in the fact that the creature hadn't moved at all during our encounter and how it had vanished in that split second when I looked away. What struck me most about our conversation was when he pulled out a file with similar reports from the area, some from experienced hunters and guides like myself, others from hikers or campers. The details varied, but there were commonalities. The overwhelming smell, the unnatural stillness, the impossible silence with which these things moved. I've replayed that encounter in my mind countless times over the years. I've questioned everything about it. Was it just a bear that my mind transformed into something more bizarre? Was I more exhausted than I realized and hallucinated the whole thing? But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I smelled. I've been back to those woods many times since then. I still hunt there every season. I've never encountered anything like that again, but I'm more cautious now. I don't hunt alone anymore. I'm more aware of my surroundings, more attuned to sudden changes in the forest's atmosphere. Sometimes, when I'm in a particularly remote area and the forest goes quiet, I get that feeling again, like I'm being watched. I'll catch a faint whiff of something unpleasant on the breeze, and my hand will instinctively tighten on my rifle. But it never develops into anything more. What bothers me most, even 15 years later, isn't the possibility that something unknown is out there in the woods. It's the fact that in that brief moment when our eyes met, and I'm certain it was looking right at me, I felt recognized, not as prey, not as a threat, but as something familiar. Like it knew exactly what I was, while I had no idea what I was looking at. I'm 63 now. I've spent most of my life in these forests. I thought I knew them inside and out. But that day in September 2007 taught me that the wilderness still holds secrets, and some of them might be better left undiscovered. I've never told my family about this. My hunting buddies would never let me hear the end of it. But I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I'd encountered in my 35 years of hunting, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, standing perfectly still in the trees, watching and waiting. The rational part of my brain says there must be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of undocumented animal. Maybe the light and shadows played tricks on my eyes. Maybe the smell was from some kind of natural gas release from the ground that affected my perception. But another part of me knows better. In those 90 seconds, everything I thought I knew about the natural world was challenged. And the fact that I can't explain it, can't categorize it, can't file it away neatly with the rest of my experiences, that's what truly haunts me. I still go into the woods. I still hunt. But I never eat chocolate out there anymore, and I never ever take my eyes off what I'm looking at, not even for a second. Story 8. I've been holding this in for almost 17 years now. My wife says I should just let it go, but I can't. What I saw that day in 2007 was real, and I need to get this off my chest. I've lived on the BC coast for over 30 years. I know what bears look like. I know what cougars look like. Hell, I even know what a wolf looks like when it's half hidden in the underbrush at dusk. This wasn't any of those things. It was March 30th, 2007. I remember the date exactly because we were heading to Tofino for our anniversary weekend. My wife had booked us this little cabin right on the beach, and we were going to spend 3 days just walking along the shore and eating seafood. The forecast was actually decent for once. No rain predicted until Sunday afternoon. We left Port Alberni around 2 p.m. If you've never driven that highway, Highway 4 between Port Alberni and Tofino, it's this winding road that cuts through mountains and follows rivers and lakes. Beautiful drive, but you have to keep your eyes on the road because there are these blind corners and the occasional logging truck coming at you. We were about halfway to Tofino, right along the stretch where the highway runs beside the Kennedy River. My wife was fiddling with the radio, trying to find something other than static. I was focused on driving, but not so focused that I didn't notice movement off to my right. At first, I thought it was a black bear. That's normal around here. You see them digging through berry bushes or sometimes fishing for salmon when they're running. Nothing unusual about a bear. I even remember thinking, oh, I should point that out to Susan. But then I took a second look, and the words died in my throat. It wasn't a bear, not even close. This thing was perched on a thick tree branch that hung out over the water. The branch must have been 15 feet above the river. It was crouched there, balanced perfectly, with one arm dangling down toward the water like it was trying to catch fish. The posture alone was all wrong for a bear. This thing was squatting almost like a person would, with its knees bent and its back straight. The hair on it was dark brown, almost black and long, not like fur but more like human hair that had never been cut. It covered most of its body, but I could see its face had less hair around the eyes and mouth area. The face. God, the face is what convinced me this wasn't some bear or known animal. It had this human-like quality to it, but primitive, like those reconstructions you see of early humans in natural history museums. I only saw it for maybe 6 or 7 seconds as we drove by. The road curved right after that spot, but I looked back over my shoulder, trying to keep sight of it. Susan asked me what was wrong, and I couldn't even answer her at first. I just kept thinking, that's not possible. That can't be real. But it was real. I was stone-cold sober, wide awake, and seeing clearly in broad daylight. What I saw was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. If someone had told me this story before that day, I'd have nodded politely while thinking they were either lying or confused. But I know what I saw. Based on the branch it was on and comparing it to the trees around it, this thing had to be huge. If it stood upright, it would have been 7 feet tall, easy. And the mass of it, I'd estimate around 500 pounds, but it wasn't fat. It was all muscle and bone, with these broad shoulders that tapered down to a more narrow waist, nothing like a bear's profile. When we got to the cabin in Tofino, I finally told Susan what I'd seen. She thought I was joking at first, then she got concerned that I might have been hallucinating or something. I didn't blame her. I almost wished I had been seeing things. It would have been easier to explain. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about it. We'd walk along the beach, and my mind would drift back to that creature by the river. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear in a weird position. Maybe the light played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. When we got back home, I started researching. I looked up Sasquatch sightings in BC, specifically on Vancouver Island. Turns out there have been dozens of reported sightings over the years, many of them along that same highway corridor. People described seeing similar features: the height, the hair, the human-like face, but with those pronounced brow ridges. A few months later, I got in touch with a woman named Colleen MacDonald, who investigates these kinds of sightings. I was nervous about it. I'm not the type who goes around claiming to see monsters or aliens. I'm a practical person. I worked in forestry for 25 years. I'm used to being in the wilderness and knowing what belongs there and what doesn't. Colleen took me seriously, though. She asked detailed questions about the time of day, the weather conditions, what exactly I observed about its behavior and appearance. Then she suggested we go back to the spot. We went in July, about 4 months after my sighting. We couldn't get to the exact spot on the riverbank. The underbrush was too thick, and the embankment was steep where the highway runs above it. But we hiked some trails above the location, and Colleen pointed out things I wouldn't have noticed. Arched saplings in the forest that she said could be indicators of large creatures moving through regularly. The forest there is second growth, not old growth, but still dense and remote once you get away from the highway. We also saw a ton of deer trails and scat, which Colleen said was significant because it showed there was plenty of food in the area. If something like what I saw existed, it would need substantial food sources. One thing that stuck with me from that visit was standing on a ridge above the river and looking down at where I'd seen the creature. From that vantage point, I could see how perfect that spot would be for fishing. The river narrows there, forcing the fish into a more confined passage, and that overhanging branch provided the perfect perch for something that wanted to reach down and grab them. Since then, I've told very few people about what I saw. My closest friends know, and most of them give me the benefit of the doubt because they know I'm not one for tall tales or exaggerations. But I can see the skepticism in their eyes. I get it. I'd be skeptical too. But here's the thing. I know what bears look like. I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands in my time in BC. Black bears, grizzlies, I know them by their silhouettes, by how they move, by their proportions. This was not a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume either. We were moving at about 60 km/h, and this thing was at least 50 feet from the highway, partially obscured by foliage. Nobody would go to those lengths for a prank that might not even be seen. Over the years, I've gone back to that spot a few times. I've never seen it again, but each time I go, I find myself scanning the trees along the riverbank, hoping for another glimpse. Not to validate what I know I saw, but because there was something almost peaceful about the creature. It wasn't menacing or aggressive, it was just fishing, existing in its world. The Kennedy River area has changed since 2007. There's been more development, more tourists heading to Tofino. I wonder sometimes if increased human activity has pushed these creatures deeper into the wilderness, further from roads and the noise of civilization. I've read accounts from indigenous communities along the coast who have stories about wild men of the woods going back generations. They speak of them not as myths, but as another species sharing the land with us. After what I saw, those stories resonate differently with me now. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I still see it in my mind, that massive, hair-covered form, perfectly balanced on that branch, arm extended toward the water below, completely unaware it was being observed. The image is burned into my memory with a clarity that hasn't faded with time. I know there are people who spend their whole lives looking for evidence of Sasquatch. They set up trail cameras and organize expeditions into remote areas. They analyze supposed footprints and audio recordings of strange howls in the forest. I respect their dedication, but that's not me. I wasn't looking for anything that day in March 2007. I was just driving to Tofino with my wife, looking forward to our weekend away. Maybe that's how it happens. The most extraordinary things find you when you're not looking for them at all. It's been nearly 17 years, and I still don't have a better explanation for what I saw. I've considered every possibility, every rational alternative. Nothing fits except the conclusion I came to within seconds of seeing it. I witnessed a Sasquatch fishing in the Kennedy River on Vancouver Island. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wish I could convince myself it wasn't real. It would be easier that way. But I know what I saw. It was as real as the trees and the river and the road beneath our tires. I've never gone public with this before. My wife thinks I should just let it go, that no good comes from being that guy who claims he saw Bigfoot. She's probably right. But keeping this bottled up for 17 years has been its own kind of burden. So there it is, March 30th, 2007. Piney River. A creature that shouldn't exist according to science, fishing from a branch just like our ancestors might have done thousands of years ago. I saw it with my own eyes, clear as day, and nothing anyone says will ever convince me otherwise. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me too, in that fleeting moment as we drove by. If it turned its head just slightly and our eyes met across the distance. I don't remember that happening, but I wonder about it all the same, and I wonder what it would have thought, seeing me, just another human passing through its territory, unaware of its existence until that chance moment when our two worlds briefly collided. Story 9. I've been sitting on this for years, not really knowing who to tell, or if anyone would even believe me. I've read so many of your stories here, and I think it's finally time to share what happened to me and my fiancée Jennifer back in March 2008. This experience completely changed our lives and how we view the world around us. It was a pretty normal Sunday evening. Jennifer and I had been visiting some friends in Beckley, West Virginia, and were heading back east on I-64 around 6:45 p.m. The sun was starting to set, giving everything that golden hour glow. I was driving, paying attention to the road, while Jennifer was looking out the passenger window at the mountainside. Suddenly, she grabbed my arm so hard I nearly swerved. "David, stop the car! Pull over!" She was practically shouting. "What? What is it?" I asked, startled but trying to keep the car steady. "I saw something on that hillside. People, or I don't know. Something big, really big." Her voice had this edge to it I'd never heard before. Now you need to understand that Jennifer was the ultimate skeptic about anything paranormal or cryptid-related. I was the one who watched those cheesy Bigfoot documentaries while she rolled her eyes. So for her to react this way, I knew something was up. I couldn't stop immediately since we were on the interstate, but I took the next exit near Hinton and turned around. We found a place to park near the visitor center, and I grabbed the binoculars I kept in the glove compartment for bird watching. "Show me where you saw them," I said. Jennifer pointed toward a small hill about 150 yards from the road. "Over there, between those trees." I focused the binoculars and almost dropped them when I saw what she was pointing at. My hands started shaking, and I felt this weird electricity go through my body. There, standing clear as day, were 4 figures that looked nothing like humans. 2 large ones, and I mean large, at least 7 to 8 feet tall, and 2 smaller ones that seemed to be about 5 feet tall. They were covered in black hair, not patchy like you'd see on a bear, but uniform, thick, and hanging maybe 4 to 6 inches from their limbs. The hair wasn't shaggy or matted like you might expect, but looked almost groomed in a way. "Do you see them?" Jennifer whispered, even though there was no way they could hear us from that distance. "Yeah," was all I could manage to say. My mouth had gone completely dry. The 2 larger ones were standing upright, perfectly bipedal, watching the smaller ones who were sitting on the ground. What struck me most was how familiar they seemed. Like a family, the way they positioned themselves, with the larger ones standing protectively over the smaller ones, it reminded me of parents watching their kids. The larger ones kept doing this strange motion, squatting down and then standing back up. At first, I thought maybe they were picking things up off the ground, but then I realized they might be communicating with the little ones. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to try something. I've watched enough wildlife shows to know that sometimes animals respond to calls. So I cupped my hands around my mouth and let out a loud howl. Jennifer looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed. But before I could answer, the largest creature stopped what it was doing and turned directly toward us. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I felt it looking at me. Then it did something I'll never forget. It started swaying between the trees, moving its upper body back and forth like a gorilla does when it's displaying. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I howled again, a bit softer this time. The large creature immediately stopped swaying and moved down the hill toward one of the smaller ones. It bent over the juvenile, and that's when I saw its arms. Jesus Christ, those arms. They had to span at least 6 feet. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Too long, too powerful looking. The fingers looked longer than ours, too, though I couldn't make out fine details at that distance. Jennifer was gripping my arm so tight it hurt. "David, what are they?" she whispered. I could hear the fear in her voice, but also this weird awe. I think they're Sasquatch," I said, barely believing the words coming out of my mouth. We stayed there watching them for about 15 minutes. They didn't do anything dramatic, no charging at us or beating their chests or anything you see in movies. They just existed, going about their business like we weren't even there. The little ones stayed close to the ground the whole time, while the adults remained standing. Occasionally, one adult would squat near a juvenile, then stand again. Eventually, Jennifer started getting really nervous. The sun was setting fast, and the thought of being near these creatures in the dark was too much. So we left, driving in complete silence for the first 20 minutes. We were both trying to process what we'd seen. "No one will believe us," Jennifer finally said. "I know," I replied. And I did know. Even with what we'd seen with our own eyes, it sounded crazy saying it out loud. But we couldn't leave it alone. The following weekend, we went back. This time we brought our dog, Dashin. He's a German shepherd, usually super calm and well-behaved. We parked in the same spot and hiked toward where we'd seen the creatures. Dashin started acting weird almost immediately. His hackles went up, and he kept whining and tugging at his leash. About 100 yards into the woods, he just stopped dead and refused to go any further. His ears were flat against his head, and he was making this low growling sound I'd never heard from him before. We came across what looked like a bedding area, a large circular depression in the ground where the grass and undergrowth had been flattened down. The area around it smelled musky, kind of like a wet dog, but stronger and more wild. There were broken branches around the area too, snapped off at heights no human could reach without a ladder. That's when I felt it. This feeling of being watched that was so intense, it made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't like being observed by a person. It felt primal, like being sized up by a predator. "David," Jennifer whispered, "we need to go." But before we left, I spotted something on the soft ground near the bedding area. Footprints, huge footprints. I put my size 13 boot next to one for comparison. The print was at least 2 inches longer and 8 inches wide. The impression was deep too, suggesting whatever made it was extremely heavy. I took some photos with my phone, but they didn't capture the scale properly. You couldn't really tell how massive they were unless you were standing right there. Dashin was practically dragging us back to the car at this point. He's never acted like that before or since. Dogs know things we don't. We made one more trip the following week. This time, we brought a better camera and some plaster to try and make casts of any footprints we found. We were about a quarter-mile into the woods when something hit a tree trunk about 10 feet to our right. It was a rock, about the size of a baseball. It hadn't fallen, it had been thrown, hard enough to leave a mark on the bark. We both froze. Jennifer clutched my arm, and we slowly looked up toward the top of the hill. For just a second, just one brief moment, I saw it. A large, dark, bipedal figure standing between 2 trees, partially obscured by branches. It was only visible for maybe 2 seconds before it stepped back and disappeared into the thicker forest. That's when Jennifer lost it. She started pulling me back toward the car, practically running. I didn't fight her on it. That feeling of being watched had intensified tenfold, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. We never went back after that. The most remarkable thing about all this was how it changed Jennifer. She went from being the world's biggest skeptic to someone who spent hours researching Sasquatch sightings and behavior patterns. She even joined some online groups dedicated to tracking and documenting encounters. She said what convinced her most wasn't just seeing them, but observing how they interacted with each other, those familiar, almost human-like family dynamics. I still think about that day all the time, about what those creatures were doing there, how long they've been living in those woods without being discovered, how many more might be out there. I think about their intelligence too. That rock wasn't thrown randomly. It was a warning. They knew exactly what they were doing. Sometimes I wonder if they watch the roads, observing us the way we observe them, if they recognize our cars or our faces, if they know we saw them. The most unsettling part is how close they were to a major interstate highway. Thousands of people drive that stretch of I-64 every day, never knowing what's watching them from the hills. It makes me wonder how many other places like that exist, where these creatures live their lives just out of our sight. I've never been able to look at the forests of West Virginia the same way again. Every time we drive that stretch of highway, I find myself scanning the tree line. Sometimes I think I see movement, shapes that don't quite belong. Jennifer usually squeezes my hand when she notices me doing it. We still haven't told many people about what we saw. It's hard to talk about something like this without sounding crazy, but I know what I saw. I know they're real. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still get that feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, that certainty that I'm being watched by something that doesn't want to be seen. Every strange sound in the forest, every unexplained movement in the trees, it all means something different to me now, because I know they're out there. The Sasquatch family of Hinton, West Virginia, going about their lives, raising their young, staying hidden, but not hidden enough. Not that day in March 2008, when they changed our lives forever. Story 10. I never thought I'd be one of those people. You know, the ones who swear they've seen something that shouldn't exist. But here I am, 5 years later, still unable to shake what happened that afternoon in May 2001. My wife Ellen and I still talk about it sometimes, usually late at night when the house is quiet and we're both feeling reflective. We'll look at each other and just know what the other is thinking about. Those eyes, that impossible movement, the way it just knew we were there. We were cycling that day in Pierce County, Washington. It was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest afternoons, not too hot, not raining for once, with that rich green everywhere that makes you glad to be alive. Ellen and I had taken the day off work to celebrate our anniversary with a bike ride through some of the more scenic parts near the Piney River Valley. We're not hardcore cyclists or anything, just casual weekend riders who enjoy getting out in nature. Around 4:30 p.m., we stopped at this viewpoint that overlooks the valley. It's pretty spectacular. You can see for miles across the forest and the river cutting through it. We'd been riding for a couple hours and needed a break, so we propped our bikes against a guardrail and walked over to take in the view. Ellen was taking pictures with our new digital camera. About a year after our encounter, we went back to the site with Scott. It was strange returning there. I felt a mix of fear and almost hope. Like part of me wanted to see it again, to confirm I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Scott examined the area and took measurements, the distance from the viewpoint to where we'd spotted the figure, the terrain features, angles of visibility. He explained that the river noise would have masked any sounds we made up on the viewpoint, which might explain why we got to observe it for those few seconds before it detected us. But how did it know we were there? Ellen asked. We weren't making any noise. It didn't turn around fully, just its head sideways. Scott just nodded like this was a common question. They have extremely acute senses, he said. Better peripheral vision than humans, better hearing, and likely better smell too. It probably knew you were there the moment you arrived, but chose to ignore you until it realized you were watching it. That thought gave me chills. The idea that it knew we were there the whole time, that the moment of eye contact wasn't it discovering us, but acknowledging that we'd discovered it. It's been 5 years now since that day at the Carbon River. Ellen and I still go cycling, but we've never gone back to that particular trail. Not out of fear exactly, but more out of respect. That space belongs to something else, something that was there long before us and will be there long after. I still think about those eyes sometimes, the intelligence in them, the knowing. It wasn't a dumb animal we spotted that day. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else entirely, something that walks a different path through this world than we do, something that knows how to stay hidden except for those rare moments when our paths cross. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Before it happened to me, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what we saw. Ellen knows what we saw. And somewhere out there in the forests of Washington, that creature knows what we saw too. That's what stays with me the most. Not just that I saw it, but that it saw me. And in that brief moment of connection, across species and understanding, something passed between us that I still can't fully explain. Recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement of each other's existence in a world we both inhabit but rarely share. I don't know if I'll ever see another Sasquatch in my lifetime. Part of me hopes I do. Part of me is terrified of the possibility. But I'll never forget that day in May 2001, when the world as I understood it shifted, just a little, just enough to make room for something I never believed could exist. And sometimes, when we're hiking or driving through forested areas, I catch myself scanning the tree lines, the shadows between trunks, the riverbanks in the distance. Not searching exactly, just acknowledging that I'm not the only one watching. Story 11. I never thought I'd share this story online, but I guess I need to get it off my chest after all these years. I've told a few close friends, but most people just laugh it off or think I'm making it up. I'm not. What happened that day in July 1980 was real, and it still gives me chills when I think about it. I was 12 years old that summer. My dad, Michael, took me and my cousin Tyler fishing at Deer Creek in Ross County, Ohio. It was supposed to be just a normal fishing trip, something we did pretty often when the weather was nice. Dad knew all the good spots, and he'd been taking me there since I was old enough to hold a fishing rod. We'd spent most of the day wading through the creek, catching a few smallmouth bass. Nothing special, just enjoying being outdoors. I remember it was hot, really humid like Ohio summers get, and the water felt nice and cool on my legs. Tyler was 14 and thought he knew everything about fishing, which annoyed me, but Dad just laughed it off. That's just how Dad was, patient with everyone. It must have been around 4 or 5 in the afternoon when we decided to head back to the car. The sun wasn't setting yet, but Dad wanted to get home before dark. We started wading downstream, taking our time, splashing through the shallow parts of the creek. I remember nearly losing my balance on some slippery rocks and Dad telling me to be careful. About halfway back to where we'd parked, I stepped into what looked like normal creek mud, but turned out to be this deep, sticky mess. I sank in almost to my knees, and Dad had to help pull me out. I lost one of my old sneakers for a minute before fishing it out, all covered in black muck. Tyler laughed at me while I tried to rinse it off in the creek water. The shoes stayed wet and squishy for the rest of the walk, making this weird, squelching sound with every step. That's when I first noticed the smell. I thought maybe I'd stepped in something dead at first. It was that bad. Like someone had taken roadkill, left it in the sun for days, then dumped rotten eggs all over it. I remember pinching my nose and asking Dad if someone had farted, trying to be funny. But Dad didn't laugh. He didn't even seem to hear me. He'd stopped walking suddenly and was staring at something on the left bank of the creek. Tyler and I caught up to him, and I followed his gaze but didn't see anything special at first. Just trees and brush along the bank. "What are you looking at?" Tyler asked, squinting in the same direction. Dad didn't answer right away. His whole body had gone rigid, and I could see his knuckles turning white where he gripped his fishing rod. "Dad?" I tugged at his shirt, a little worried now. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice sounding strange. "Just don't make any sudden movements." Tyler rolled his eyes. "It's just a dead tree or something," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, I could tell he was starting to see what Dad was seeing. His face changed, the cocky teenage expression melting into something else. And then I saw it too. Standing among the brush, partially hidden but clearly visible from the waist up, was something. Something big. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? No, the shape was all wrong. It had reddish-brown hair all over, and the hair was moving slightly in the breeze. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Bigfoot," Dad said tensely, the word barely audible. I'd heard of Bigfoot before. What kid hadn't? We'd watched those cheesy documentaries and In Search of episodes on TV, but this wasn't like the blurry images or drawings I'd seen. This was real, standing there, not 30 yards away from us, and then it turned its head and looked directly at us. I'll never forget that moment. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't making any threatening moves, it just looked at us. And somehow that was worse than if it had charged or roared or anything else. The intelligence in that look, it knew we were there, and it was deciding what to do about us. Dad broke first. "Go," he hissed, backing up slowly. "Get up the bank, now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled up the opposite creek bank, slipping on wet rocks and grabbing at roots and branches to pull ourselves up. My wet shoe made climbing harder, and I remember feeling like I was moving in slow motion, like in a nightmare where you can't run fast enough. Once we made it to the top of the bank, Dad pushed us both toward the field that separated the creek from the road where our car was parked. "Don't run yet," he warned, still looking back toward where the creature was. "Just walk fast." We walked as quickly as we could without actually running, crossing that field in what felt like forever. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The smell lingered in my nostrils, even though we were getting farther away. About halfway across the field, Tyler couldn't help himself. "Is it following us?" he asked. Dad risked a look back. "It's on the bank now," he said quietly. "Just watching us. Keep moving." I looked back too, even though Dad told me not to. And there it was, standing fully visible now on top of the creek bank. It was huge, so much bigger than I'd realized when it was partially hidden in the brush. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, and it was just watching us leave. That's what sticks with me the most, even now. It wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was observing us, studying us, like it was just as curious about us as we were terrified of it. We finally reached the car, and Dad fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so bad he dropped them once before getting the door unlocked. We piled in, and he started the engine, pulling onto the road so fast the tires kicked up gravel. For the first few minutes of the drive, nobody said anything. Then Tyler broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? Dad, who never swore in front of us, didn't even correct Tyler's language. "I don't know for sure," he said, his knuckles still white on the steering wheel. "But it looked like what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch." "It looked like a person," I said, my voice small. "A really big, really hairy person." Dad nodded. "That's what got me too. When it turned and looked at us, that face. It wasn't an animal face. Not exactly." We talked about it the whole way home, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The more we talked, the more details I remembered. The way it was slightly stooped, almost like it was trying to hide in the brush. The massive breadth of its shoulders, the dark face amid all that reddish-brown hair. Dad made us promise not to tell Mom right away. She'll just worry and never let us go fishing again, he said. But I could tell he was shaken up too. Dad wasn't the kind of man who got scared easily. He'd served in Vietnam and didn't talk about it much. But I knew he'd seen some bad things there, yet this had him rattled. The next day, Dad went to work like normal. He was a foreman at a construction site, and when he came home that evening, he had another story to add to ours. His boss, who had laughed off Dad's account that morning, came to him white-faced in the afternoon. Apparently, the boss's son and girlfriend had been riding horses near Deer Creek that day, in the same general area where we'd been fishing. Both horses had suddenly gone crazy, throwing their riders and bolting. When they finally caught up to the horses, they were still skittish and refused to go back to that part of the creek. The boss's son said there had been a terrible smell that spooked the horses. Dad and his boss looked at each other, and Dad said his boss wasn't laughing anymore. Over the next few weeks, we heard a couple other stories from people in the area about strange noises at night and pets acting weird. But eventually, like all local excitement, it died down. People moved on to other topics, and when school started in the fall, I had other things to think about. But I never forgot. How could I? For years after, I had dreams about that moment when it turned and looked at us. Sometimes in the dreams, it would start walking toward us. Sometimes it would speak. I'd wake up in a cold sweat either way. Dad and I barely talked about it as the years went by. I think we both were trying to rationalize it away. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was some hermit living in the woods. Maybe the light and shadows played tricks on our eyes. But we both knew what we saw. 24 years later, in 2004, I found a website for something called the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. They seemed like serious people, not the tinfoil hat types. I reached out and told them our story. To my surprise, they wanted to meet with us. Dad was reluctant at first. He'd built a whole life where that day was just a strange memory, not something to dwell on. He was close to retirement and didn't want people at work thinking he was crazy. But I convinced him, and one weekend we met with an investigator from the BFRO and took him to the spot on Deer Creek. Walking back there after all those years was surreal. The creek looked smaller than I remembered, the way places from your childhood often do. But when we got to the spot where it happened, the feeling came rushing back, that sense of something watching, something not quite right. Dad opened up more than I expected. He told the investigator things he'd never even told me, like how he'd first noticed the creature watching us while Tyler and I were fishing, before we even started heading back. He didn't say anything because he wasn't sure what he was seeing and didn't want to scare us. It was massive, he told the investigator, his voice steady but quiet. Not 8 feet like Bobby thought, more like 10 or 12 feet tall and heavy, 800, maybe 900 pounds, all covered in hair except for the face, which was dark, almost black. He described how when it first spotted him watching it, it turned slightly, and that's when he saw just how enormous its head was, how broad its shoulders. After we got up the bank, Dad continued, I looked back, and it had stepped out onto the high bank too, just watching us as we walked away, not threatening, not chasing, just observing. The investigator took notes and asked specific questions about the creature's movements, the sounds in the area, the exact location. He seemed to take us seriously, which was a first for sharing this story with anyone outside the family. At one point, he asked Dad about the creature's face, since Dad had the clearest view of it. Dad was quiet for a moment before answering. It wasn't like an ape, he finally said. That's what gets me. All these drawings and recreations you see, they make it look like some missing link between apes and humans. But what I saw, the face was more human than ape, the eyes especially. There was, I don't know how to explain it, an awareness there. The investigator nodded, like this confirmed something he'd heard before. We walked around the area for a while longer, but there was nothing to find after so many years. No footprints, no hair samples, nothing that would prove what we'd seen. Just the memory, still vivid after all that time. On the drive back home, Dad and I talked more openly about that day than we ever had before. "You know," he said, "I've had a lot of time to think about this, to try to explain it away, but I know what I saw, and sometimes I wonder if it's still out there." I nodded. "I wonder if it remembers us too." Dad gave a short laugh. "3 humans, scrambling up a creek bank like scared rabbits. Yeah, I bet it remembers." To this day, I can't explain what we saw at Deer Creek. I've read all the theories, that Bigfoot is some undiscovered primate, that it's an interdimensional being, that it's all just misidentifications and hoaxes. None of them quite fit what we experienced. All I know is what I saw. A massive, hair-covered creature that moved with purpose and intelligence, that watched us with knowing eyes, and that let us go without incident. It could have easily caught us if it wanted to. We were stumbling and panicking, and it looked powerful enough to cover that distance in seconds, but it just watched us leave. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would believe me if I didn't have Dad and Tyler to back up the story. Sometimes I wonder if I'd believe it myself if I hadn't been there. But that smell, that sight, that feeling of being observed by something not quite animal, but not quite human either, those things don't fade, even after all these years. I still go fishing, but never alone, and never at Deer Creek. Watcom, Story 12. I still shake every damn time I think about what happened last September. My dad, Thomas, and I were out in Watcom County, Washington, doing some night scanning in this huge clear-cut area. It was September 3rd, 2018. I remember the date because it was Labor Day weekend, and we decided to take advantage of the time off to do some wildlife spotting. My dad's been an outdoorsman his whole life, taught me everything I know about tracking and wildlife identification. We'd been doing these night excursions since I was a teenager, but nothing could have prepared us for what we saw that night. It was about 9 p.m. when we got set up. Perfect conditions. Clear sky, almost no wind. Moon was bright enough to see the outline of the landscape, but not so bright that it would affect our night vision. The clear cut was massive, maybe 300, 400 yards across, with dense forest surrounding it on all sides. We had positioned ourselves on a slight rise at the north end, giving us a good vantage point to scan the area with our lights. We were using these high-powered LED flashlights, the kind that can throw a beam for several hundred yards. Dad was scanning the eastern tree line while I was working the western edge. We weren't really expecting to see much. Maybe some deer, possibly a black bear if we were lucky. That's usually what we'd find during these outings. About 20 minutes in, Dad nudged my arm and pointed toward the southern edge of the clear cut. "You see that?" he whispered. At first I didn't. Then I caught it. Eyeshine. 3 distinct sets of eyeshine reflecting our lights back at us. Orange-yellow in color, which initially made me think bear. But something was off right away. The eyeshine was at 3 different heights. One was really high, one was a bit lower, and one was much closer to the ground. They were about 150 to 200 yards away from us, right at the edge where the clear cut met the tree line. "Bear family?" I whispered back, but even as I said it, I knew something wasn't right. The highest eyeshine was way too tall for a black bear, even if it was standing. Dad just shook his head slowly. "I don't think so." We kept our lights on them, and that's when things went from curious to terrifying. The tallest pair of eyes suddenly disappeared, and a second later, we heard movement. Not just movement, charging. Something massive was running along the eastern tree line, coming uphill toward our position. Fast. Really fucking fast. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Heavy footfalls, but not like a bear or deer. It was rhythmic, powerful, and frighteningly deliberate. As it ran, it started vocalizing. Not growling or roaring like a bear. This was different. a deep, guttural sound that seemed to carry through my entire body. It was loud enough that I could feel it in my chest, even from that distance. Dad and I were frozen. We kept our lights trained on the movement, and that's when we got our first clear look. The beam caught it as it paused at the edge of the tree line, maybe 100 yards from us now. It was enormous. Tall. I'm talking 7-8 feet at minimum. Broad shoulders, covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. This thing was standing upright, on 2 legs. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds, then turned back toward where the other 2 sets of eyeshine were still visible. It made another vocalization, lower this time, almost like a call. Then the other 2 eyeshines started moving toward it. That's when Dad grabbed my arm. His grip was so tight it hurt, but I barely registered it. "Jackson," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to stay absolutely still." The largest creature then turned toward the forest and started moving in our direction, not along the tree line anymore, but through the woods that separated us. We could hear it breaking through underbrush, snapping branches, not even small ones, but sounds like saplings and decent-sized limbs being broken. It was moving with purpose, directly toward our position. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing we could do. Whatever this thing was, it could outrun us easily, especially in the dark. Then, suddenly, silence. Complete and absolute silence. No breaking branches, no footfalls, nothing. The forest went dead quiet. No insects, no nightbirds, nothing. Just absolute stillness. But the 2 smaller creatures remained at the edge of the tree line. We could still see their eyeshine, occasionally moving, watching us. They stayed there, just observing. Sometimes one would shift position slightly, moving a few yards one way or the other, but they never ventured fully into the open, clear cut. For the next 3 hours, I'm not exaggerating, 3 hours, we stayed in that standoff. The smallest creature occasionally made soft vocalizations, almost like whimpers or chirps. Whenever we would shift position or make any noise, they would immediately freeze, then resume their watching after a few minutes. Dad and I barely spoke during this time, just occasional whispers about what we should do. We decided our best option was to stay put until daylight, but honestly, I don't think either of us would have moved even if we wanted to. We were completely transfixed by what we were seeing. Around midnight, I checked my watch repeatedly during this whole ordeal. Something changed. We heard movement from the woods where the largest creature had disappeared. Heavy footsteps approaching the tree line again. Then it emerged. It stepped out from the trees about 75 yards from us. The moonlight and our flashlights gave us the clearest view yet. This was no bear, no human in a suit, nothing I'd ever seen before or could rationally explain away. It was massive, just impossibly big. Broad shoulders that tapered to a narrower waist, long arms that hung down past its hips. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Too big, too powerful. Its head sat directly on those shoulders, almost no neck visible. It stood at the edge for a moment, then did something I'll never forget as long as I live. It stepped over this huge fallen log, just casually, like stepping over a curb, and began walking downhill toward the middle of the clear cut. Walking. On 2 legs, not shambling or hunched over like a bear might do for a few steps. This was a natural bipedal gait. Its arms swung slightly as it walked, just like a person's would. The other 2, which I now could see were significantly smaller versions of the first, followed behind it. The medium one was probably a head shorter than the big one, and the smallest was maybe half the height of the largest. A family. That's the only way I can describe what I was seeing. A family of something. I couldn't help myself. I called out, not loud, just above a whisper. "Hey!" Dad hissed at me to shut up, but it was too late. The largest creature stopped immediately and turned to look in our direction. The head movement was so human-like it sent chills through me. It was this distinctive head bob, the kind of movement you see when someone is walking downhill and turns to look behind them. It stood absolutely still for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it made a low sound, not aggressive, more like communicative. The two smaller ones immediately moved back toward the tree line. The largest one followed them, and they disappeared into the forest. We stayed put for another hour, not daring to move. When we finally did leave, we moved slowly, constantly looking around us, back to back as we made our way to our truck. The drive home was almost completely silent. What could we even say? The next day, against my better judgment, I went back. Dad refused to come. Said once was enough for him, but I had to see if there was any evidence, anything to prove to myself that I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. The area where they had been looked torn up, disturbed vegetation, broken branches, but the ground was too dry for footprints. I found the log that the creature had stepped over so casually. I tried to do the same and couldn't. It came up to my mid-thigh, and I'm 6'1". Whatever that thing was, it had legs long enough to just step over this obstacle like it was nothing. I've spent the last 8 months trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched similar encounters, spoken with a BFRO investigator named Kevin Llewellyn, who interviewed both Dad and me separately. He seemed to believe us, which was something at least. Dad and I have talked about it more since then. He estimates the largest creature weighed around 700 pounds. We both agree on the speeds we witnessed. When it first charged along the tree line, it covered about 50 yards in seconds. No human could move that fast through rough terrain in the dark. I've gone back and forth between wanting to tell everyone and wanting to tell no one. Who would believe it? I barely believe it myself, and I saw it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw. I know those weren't bears or elk or anything else I've ever encountered in all my years in those woods. I haven't gone night scanning since. Dad has, but never in that area. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night hearing that deep vocalization in my head. Sometimes I can still see those orange-yellow eyes watching us from the darkness. I don't know what we encountered that night in Watcom County. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. All I know is that they're out there, and they're watching. Story 13. I still haven't told many people about what happened that morning on the Big Piney. It's been over 6 years now, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, you know? It was our annual canoe trip. Me, Mike, Dave, Jason, and Chris. We'd been doing this trip every summer for almost a decade. We're all outdoorsy guys, comfortable in the woods, not the type to get spooked easily. We'd chosen the Big Piney River in Pulaski County because it's beautiful, secluded, and the fishing is great. This particular stretch runs along the edge of Fort Leonard Wood Military Base, which means there are sections where you can only access the riverbanks by water. No roads, no trails, just untouched wilderness. We put in on July 7th, 2017, planning for 3 days on the river. The weather was perfect, not too hot for July in Missouri with clear skies. We made good time that first day, stopping around 4 p.m. to set up camp on this nice flat area about 20 feet back from the water. It was a great spot, a smooth gravel bar leading to the water, plenty of flat ground for our tents, and some trees for shade. We set up our tents in a rough semicircle facing the river, with our cooking area closer to the water. That evening was completely normal. We fished a bit, caught a few smallmouth bass, built a fire, cooked dinner, had some beers, and bullshitted about our jobs and families until about midnight. Nothing unusual happened, no strange noises, no weird feelings. We were just 5 guys enjoying the outdoors. I woke up early the next morning, around 5:30 a.m. The sun was just starting to come up, and there was this thin mist hanging over the river. It was peaceful. Everyone else was still asleep, and I needed to take a leak, so I quietly unzipped my tent and stepped outside. I didn't want to piss right next to camp. So I walked down toward the gravel bar where the river curved slightly. I was about 50 yards from our tents when I saw it. Across the river, standing on top of this massive pile of logs and debris that had built up during the spring floods, was something. Something huge. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was just this dark shape against the early morning light. But then it moved, and I realized I was looking at some kind of creature standing upright on this log jam that was maybe 10-12 feet tall. The log jam was this tangled mess of trees, branches, and river debris that had collected at a bend in the river. Spring flooding had pushed all this stuff into a pile, creating this weird natural observation platform overlooking our campsite. And this thing was just standing there, watching. When I try to describe this to people, they always ask how I knew it was looking at our camp. I just knew. Its posture, the way it was positioned, it was observing us, studying us. It had probably been watching us all night. I froze. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was looking at. And then it saw me. The moment it realized I'd spotted it, everything happened fast. The creature immediately dropped down from its perch and hit the water. This wasn't a gradual thing. It was like it made a decision in a split second. One moment it was on top of the jam. The next, it was crossing the river. The river at that point is maybe 18-20 feet wide. This thing crossed it in 2 strides. 2. There was one massive splash in the middle, then a quieter one as it reached the far bank. And then it was gone, disappearing into the thick trees and underbrush. The whole sighting lasted maybe 2 to 3 seconds. But in those seconds, I saw enough to know this wasn't a bear or a human. It was massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had dark brown, almost black hair covering its body. The build was powerfully muscular, especially through the shoulders and chest. The head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, without much of a neck. The arms were long, much longer than a human's would be. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where it had vanished. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't move like that. They don't cross rivers in 2 strides. They don't stand on log piles, watching campsites. Eventually, I managed to turn around and walk back to camp. I didn't run. I was too shocked to run. When I got back, everyone was still asleep. I just sat on a log by our dead campfire, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't tell the guys right away. I know that sounds weird, but I just couldn't figure out how to bring it up. Hey, guys! I just saw Bigfoot watching us sleep. Isn't exactly casual breakfast conversation. Plus, a part of me was worried they'd think I was messing with them, or that I'd had too much to drink the night before. So I said nothing. We all got up, made breakfast, packed up camp, and got back on the river. I was distracted all morning, constantly scanning the shoreline, jumping at every noise. The guys noticed and kept asking if I was okay. I just blamed it on not sleeping well. About an hour downstream, maybe a mile from our campsite, we pulled over at another gravel bar to stretch our legs. Jason wandered off to explore a bit while the rest of us got snacks from the cooler. A few minutes later, he called out for us to come look at something. We found him standing by the water's edge, pointing at the ground. There, pressed into the wet sand and gravel, was a footprint. A bare footprint, but not a human one. This thing was huge, easily 14 inches long. The toes were clearly defined, spreading wider than a human foot would. There was incredible depth to the print, suggesting whatever made it was extremely heavy. Next to the print was a half-eaten hogsucker fish. If you're not familiar, hogsucker is a bottom-feeding fish that most people don't eat. They're bony and don't taste great. But something had caught this one and taken several bites out of it before discarding it. That's when I finally told them. I described what I'd seen that morning, the creature on the log jam, how it had been watching our camp. how it fled when it spotted me. I described its size, its color, how it moved across the river like it was nothing. I pointed at the footprint and said, "That's what made this. That's what I saw." There was this long silence after I finished talking. The guys just looked at me, then at the footprint, then back at me. Finally, Mike said, "Why the hell didn't you wake us up?" He wasn't accusatory. He sounded genuinely disappointed that he'd missed seeing something so incredible. We spent about 30 minutes examining the print and the surrounding area, looking for more evidence. We found a few partial prints heading into the woods, but nothing as clear as the first one. Dave took some photos with his phone, laying his hunting knife, which is about 9 inches long, next to the print for scale. The rest of our trip was different. We were all on edge, constantly scanning the tree line, keeping our voices down. That night, none of us slept well. Every crack of a twig or rustle in the underbrush had us sitting upright in our tents. We decided to cut the trip short and paddled out the next morning. Over the years, I've replayed that morning in my head countless times. I've second-guessed what I saw, wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I remember that footprint, and I know what I saw was real. I've since learned that the area around the Big Piney, especially near Fort Leonard Wood, is perfect habitat for something like a Sasquatch. It's heavily wooded, with plentiful food and water sources. The military base itself covers over 61,000 acres of restricted land where nobody hunts or develops. It's the perfect refuge. I've also discovered I'm not the only one who's seen something out there. In 2018, apparently a local law enforcement officer reported a similar sighting in the same general area. There have been other reports too. Hikers, campers, even military personnel who've encountered something they couldn't explain. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized us from previous years. We'd camped in that same general stretch of river before. Was it familiar with our routine? Did it know we'd have food? Was it just curious about us? I don't think it meant us any harm. If it did, it could have easily entered our camp while we slept. What bothers me most is that it was watching us. It found a perfect observation point where it could see our entire camp, our tents, our canoes, our food storage. It was calculating, intelligent. It made a choice to observe rather than interact. I still go camping and fishing. I still love the outdoors, but I'm more aware now of what might be out there in the woods, watching from the shadows. I pay attention to the feeling of being observed, to unusual silence in the forest, to inexplicable sounds in the night. That morning changed how I see the wilderness. It's still beautiful, still a place I love to be. But now I know it holds secrets. Living, breathing secrets that most people will never glimpse. We think we know what's out there, that we've catalogued and categorized every living thing in North America. But there are remote places, wild places, where things can remain hidden for generations. I know because I saw one of those things, if only for a few seconds, on a misty July morning on the Big Piney River. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the way it moved, the impossible speed and strength it displayed, or the unsettling knowledge that it had been watching us all night long. I haven't been back to that specific stretch of the Big Piney since then. The guys and I still do our annual trip, but we choose different rivers now. None of them have ever questioned why. Some things you don't need to discuss, you just understand. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe with cameras or recording equipment. Part of me wants proof, wants to show the world what's out there. But a bigger part of me thinks some things should remain mysteries. That creature has managed to stay hidden in a world where that's nearly impossible. Maybe it deserves its privacy. All I know for sure is what I saw that morning was real. It was breathing, thinking, watching, and somewhere in the dense forest surrounding the Big Piney River, I believe it's still there, moving silently through the wilderness, occasionally pausing to observe the humans who venture into its domain, then vanishing back into the shadows, leaving nothing but massive footprints and unanswered questions in its wake. Story 14. I still get chills thinking about what happened to me back in the summer of '82. I was 15, and I had this cabin my family owned near Mount St. Helens in Skamania County, Washington. We'd had it for years, and I'd spent countless weekends exploring those woods. Never once had anything weird happened until that week in July. My younger brother Thomas, 13, my cousin Ryan, 14, and my buddy Michael, 15, were staying with me at the cabin. My parents were there too, but they mostly stayed inside while we did what teenage boys do: explore, fish, and mess around in the woods. The first couple days were totally normal. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, and we'd spent most of our time hiking to this small lake about 2 miles from the cabin. On the third day, we decided to check out a different trail that I'd been on maybe a dozen times before. It started out like any other hike. We packed some sandwiches, filled our canteens, and headed out around 10 a.m. The trail wasn't particularly difficult. It was more of a game trail than anything maintained by the Park Service. It wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up into small clearings. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when I first felt it. It's hard to explain, but I suddenly had this overwhelming sensation of being watched. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between normal wilderness awareness and something genuinely unsettling. This was definitely the latter. I stopped walking and looked around. Thomas bumped into me from behind. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, not wanting to freak the younger kids out. "Just thought I heard something." But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got stronger as we continued. We reached a small clearing with a fallen log that made a perfect lunch spot. While we ate, I kept scanning the tree line. The others were joking around, throwing pine cones at each other, but I couldn't shake that feeling. By about 2 p.m., dark clouds had started rolling in. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and I knew we needed to start heading back. We were maybe a mile from the cabin when the rain started. Not just a drizzle, but one of those sudden summer downpours that soaks you in seconds. "Come on," I shouted over the rain. "Let's pick up the pace." That's when I heard it, a distinct sound of movement in the woods ahead of us. Not the normal sounds of wildlife scurrying away. This was heavy, deliberate movement, like something large pushing through underbrush. We all froze. Michael whispered, "What was that?" "Probably just a deer," I said, but I didn't believe it. Deer don't move like that. They're either still or they're bounding away. The movement stopped. We stood there, rain pouring down our faces, listening. After maybe 30 seconds of silence, I motioned for us to continue. "Stay close," I said. We moved forward more cautiously now. The rain was coming down so hard it was difficult to hear anything over it. The trail was turning into mud, making our progress slower. As we approached the edge of the forest where it opened up into the field leading to our cabin, all 4 of us stopped dead in our tracks at the same time. About 200 yards away, partially obscured by the rain and the trees, was a figure. It was just standing there, watching us. It was tall, I'd guess around 6 feet, and completely black. Not like a person wearing black clothes, but like a silhouette cut out of reality. It didn't move. It just watched. "Do you see that?" Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, unable to speak. My mouth had gone completely dry. "What is it?" Ryan asked, grabbing my arm. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we need to get to the cabin, now." The figure didn't move as we edged our way out of the forest and into the open field. Once we cleared the trees, we all took off running. I looked back once we were about halfway across the field. The figure was gone. When we got back to the cabin, we were all so shaken, we didn't even mention what we'd seen to my parents. They just assumed we were rattled by the thunderstorm. That night, None of us slept well. I kept getting up to look out the window, half expecting to see that black figure standing in the yard. The next day, the skies had cleared, and in the bright morning sunlight, what we'd seen seemed less frightening. We convinced ourselves it was probably just a hiker, or maybe even a shadow cast by the storm clouds. Kids, right? We're good at rationalizing away the things that scare us. My dad had to drive into town for supplies, so it was just us and my mum at the cabin. After breakfast, Michael suggested we go back to where we'd seen the figure. "Are you crazy?" Thomas asked. "It was probably nothing," Michael insisted. "And if it was something, don't you want to know what?" I was torn. Part of me was terrified at the thought of going back, but another part was curious. In the end, curiosity won out. We told my mum we were going fishing at the creek nearby, but instead headed straight back to where we'd seen the figure. The forest felt different in the daylight, less threatening. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched as we made our way along the trail. When we reached the spot where we'd seen the figure, we started looking around for any signs of what it might have been. At first, we found nothing. But then Ryan called us over to where he was standing, near a muddy patch of ground. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the ground. There, pressed into the mud, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. It was huge. I'd guess 4 to 6 inches longer than my foot, and I wore size 12 shoes. It was also much wider than any human foot I'd ever seen. What struck me most wasn't just the size, but the shape. It looked more like a human foot than a bear's paw. There were distinct toes, not claw marks, and a clear arch and heel. My blood ran cold. I'd grown up in Washington State. I'd heard all the Bigfoot stories. I'd always thought they were just that, stories. But staring down at that footprint, I wasn't so sure anymore. "Is that what I think it is?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just a bear track," I said, but even I didn't believe that. Bears don't leave prints that look like giant human feet. We searched the area for more prints, but couldn't find any clear ones. The ground was too dry in most places, and the one print we found was in the only patch of mud around. "We should head back," I said after a while. "Mum's going to wonder where we are." None of us argued. We started making our way back across the open field that led to the cabin. We were about halfway across when Michael suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His face went completely white, and he raised his arm, pointing toward the edge of the woods we'd just left. "Oh my God," he whispered. I turned to look, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, sitting on what looked like an old tree stump, was... I don't even know how to describe it. It was huge, covered in dark hair or fur, and unmistakably watching us. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't sit on stumps and watch people. This thing was sitting almost like a person would, but there was nothing human about it. As we stood there, frozen in terror, it turned its head to look in another direction. But the way it moved was all wrong. Instead of just turning its head, it rotated its entire upper body as if it didn't have a neck. That small detail, for some reason, terrified me more than anything else. "Run," I whispered. "Now!" We all took off, sprinting toward the cabin. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they might give out, but raw fear kept me going. I didn't look back until we reached the cabin's porch. When I did, the creature was gone. We burst through the door, all talking at once, trying to explain to my mom what we'd seen. She thought we were just playing around at first, but something in our faces must have convinced her we were genuinely scared. My dad got back from town about an hour later. Michael and I pulled him aside and told him what we'd seen. To his credit, he didn't dismiss us outright. He went into his bedroom and came back with his pistol tucked into his belt. He asked Michael if his dad had brought his hunting rifle up for the trip, and Michael nodded. "Let's go take a look," my dad said. Michael's dad, who'd been napping in the guest room, joined us when he heard what was happening. He grabbed his 7mm deer rifle, and the four of us, me, my dad, Michael, and his dad, headed back out toward where we'd seen the creature. We searched for about an hour. My dad found the footprint we'd discovered earlier and stared at it for a long time without saying anything. We didn't find any more prints or any sign of the creature. The sun was starting to get low, and we decided to head back to the cabin. We were maybe a quarter of the way across the field when I saw my mum standing on the porch, frantically waving her arms and yelling something we couldn't hear. We all turned to look behind us, and that's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something large and dark moving into the tree line at the edge of the forest. My dad and Michael's dad raised their guns, but it was already gone. We hurried back to the cabin, where my mum told us she'd seen something big moving in the trees behind us, following us. Later that evening, a game warden came by. Apparently, Michael's dad had called him. The warden listened to our story without comment, then asked us to show him where we'd seen the creature. It was nearly dark by then, but we went anyway, the adults carrying flashlights and guns. We didn't find the creature, but the warden did find an area where a large bush had been flattened, as if something heavy had been lying there. He leaned down and sniffed at it, then made a face. "Smell that?" he asked my dad. My dad leaned down, sniffed and nodded. "What is it?" I asked. "Body odor," the warden said, "mixed with urine and feces. Something's been sleeping here." That was the most terrifying day of my life. We stayed at the cabin for 3 more days, but we didn't go back into those woods. I kept waking up at night, sure I could hear heavy footsteps outside my window, but when I looked, there was never anything there. I've been back to that area many times since then. I'm a police officer now, and I've never forgotten what I saw that day. I've never told this story publicly before because, well, who would believe it? A cop who claims he saw Bigfoot as a teenager. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm out in the woods alone, I still get that feeling of being watched. I never saw the creature clearly enough to shoot at it, and honestly, I'm glad. If it had wanted to hurt me during all those times I hiked alone in those woods before that day, it could have done so many times over. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that 4 terrified teenage boys saw something that shouldn't exist. And for one summer afternoon in 1982, the monster stories we'd grown up hearing suddenly seemed a lot less like fiction and a lot more like a warning. Story 15. I've never told this story to many people. My wife knows, and a few close friends. But I rarely talk about it because I can already imagine the looks I'd get. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this is the place where people might actually believe me. This happened back in August 1999 when I was 9 years old. My dad had planned this big camping trip in northern Pennsylvania, just me, him, and my older brother Jake. Mum stayed home because she wasn't into roughing it, as Dad called it. I was super excited because Dad had promised we could go fishing and hiking and maybe even spot some deer or rabbits, which was a big deal for me since I was obsessed with animals. We had this spot in the mountains that Dad knew about. It wasn't an official campground or anything, just this secluded area where apparently Dad used to go with his own father. The nearest town was like 45 minutes away, and there was no cell service, not that cell phones were that common back then anyway. It was just trees, mountains, and silence. We arrived Friday afternoon and set up our tent. Dad made a fire pit, and Jake, who was 14 at the time, was trying to act all tough and unimpressed, even though I could tell he was excited too. That first evening was normal. We ate hot dogs. Dad told some stupid ghost stories that weren't even scary, and we went to bed in our tent. The next day, the day it happened, started out perfectly normal. We went fishing in the morning at this small lake about a mile from our campsite. I caught 2 small bass, which was a big deal for me. Jake caught nothing and was annoyed about it. We hiked back to camp for lunch, and afterward, Dad said he needed to fix something on the car, and Jake was going to help him. I was bored watching them mess with the engine, so I asked if I could explore a little. Dad looked up and said, "Sure, but don't go too far. Stay where you can still see smoke from our campfire." He pointed to the thin trail of smoke rising above the trees, "and be back before it starts getting dark." It was around 4 p.m. at this point. I grabbed my disposable camera, I was hoping to take pictures of animals, and headed off, following this dirt path that led uphill from our campsite. I knew there was a cornfield nearby because we'd passed it on our drive in. The farmer's house was nowhere near this part of the field, which stretched alongside the forest edge. After walking for maybe 15-20 minutes, I reached a spot where the path ran right between the cornfield on my left and the dense forest on my right. I remember the corn was really tall, way taller than me, and the forest was super thick with pine trees and other trees I didn't know the names of. The sun was getting lower but wasn't close to setting yet. I kept walking and scanning the forest edge, hoping to spot a deer or maybe even a fox. I was quieting my steps like my dad had taught me, trying not to scare away any animals. The forest was weirdly quiet, though. Usually you'd hear birds or squirrels or something, but there was almost nothing except the sound of the corn stalks rustling in the breeze. That's when I saw it. About 300-400 feet away, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, was something. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge, way bigger than any person I'd ever seen. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but it definitely wasn't a human. The entire body was covered in what looked like dark brown, or maybe reddish-brown fur or hair. I froze instantly. I didn't consciously decide to stop walking. My body just locked up. The thing was doing this bizarre swaying motion, like it was trying to hide behind the tree, but was too big to actually hide. It would lean out from the left side of the tree, stare directly at me, then sway back behind the trunk, only to lean out from the right side a second later. But it was so massive that even when it was hiding, I could still see parts of its body. The way it was looking at me, I'll never forget that. It wasn't just glancing in my direction, it was watching me, studying me. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell its head was huge and its eyes were fixed on me. I remember thinking, that's not a bear. I'd seen bears before when we'd gone to Yellowstone the year before, and this was nothing like a bear. Bears don't hide behind trees and peek out at you. They don't stand perfectly upright like humans, and they don't move the way this thing moved. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It might have been 30 seconds or it might have been 5 minutes. Time felt weird, like it was stretched out. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't breathing. I had this weird mix of complete terror, but also this intense curiosity. Part of me was screaming to run, but another part couldn't look away. Then something changed in me. The initial shock wore off slightly, and I found myself drawn to it. I wanted to see it better, to understand what I was looking at. Without even thinking, I took one small step forward. That single step changed everything. The creature instantly reacted, turning away from the tree and moving into the forest with shocking speed. It ran on 2 legs, not 4. Its movement was fluid, but powerful, like an athlete, but 10 times stronger. The sound it made as it crashed through the forest was incredible. Breaking branches, crushing underbrush, and making this whooshing sound that I can still hear when I think about it. It sounded like something massive displacing air as it moved. The speed was what really got to me. Something that large should not be able to move that fast. Within seconds, literally just a few seconds, it had disappeared deeper into the forest, though I could still hear it moving away for another 10-15 seconds before the forest fell completely silent again. I stood there, completely frozen. I couldn't move. My camera was still in my hand, but I'd been so shocked that I hadn't even thought to take a picture. Not that it would have shown much from that distance with a cheap disposable camera. As the shock started to wear off, I became aware of how quiet everything was. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering, nothing. It was like every animal in the area had cleared out. That's when the real fear hit me, a deep, primal fear that made my skin feel cold despite the warm August air. I started backing away slowly, never taking my eyes off the spot where the creature had disappeared. After I'd gotten about 50 feet back down the path, I turned and ran. I ran so hard my lungs burned, all the way back to our campsite. I didn't stop once. When I got back to camp, Dad and Jake were sitting by the fire. Dad looked up at me and immediately asked what was wrong. I was pale, sweating and breathing so hard I couldn't speak. Part of me wanted to tell them everything, but another part of me knew they wouldn't believe me. Jake already teased me about having an overactive imagination, and I was afraid Dad would think I was making it up for attention. So I lied. I said I thought I'd seen a bear, but it was probably just a deer. Dad seemed to accept this, told me to sit down and catch my breath, and handed me a soda from the cooler. I sat there, sipping my drink with shaking hands, trying to process what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside our tent made me jump. I kept imagining the creature finding our campsite, peering down at our tent with those eyes that had studied me so intently. Jake complained that I was tossing and turning too much. I almost told him then, but I didn't. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. We packed up and headed home. As we drove away, I stared out the window at the forest, half expecting to see the creature watching us leave. For years after that, I told no one. I was afraid people would laugh at me or think I was crazy. It wasn't until I was in high school that I started researching and came across accounts of Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings. The descriptions matched what I saw. The height, I estimate it was at least 7 to 8 feet tall. The fur, the way it moved, everything. I still think about that day often, about how the creature and I observed each other like we were both equally curious and afraid, about how it chose to flee rather than approach me, about the complete absence of wildlife in an area that should have been teeming with it. Sometimes I wonder if I should have told someone right away, if we should have gone back to look for footprints or other evidence. But I was just a kid, scared out of my mind. And honestly, part of me didn't want proof. Proof would make it real. And the reality of something like that existing in our world was too overwhelming for my 9-year-old brain to handle. I'm 33 now, and I've never been back to that specific area. I still go camping, still love hiking and nature, but I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way most people aren't. I'm always listening for that silence, that unnatural quiet that falls when something at the top of the food chain is nearby. I know how this story sounds. I know most people would say I imagined it, or that I saw a bear standing on its hind legs, or that my memory has distorted over time. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but I know what I saw that day. I saw something watching me from the edge of those woods, something intelligent enough to hide, something that moved like nothing I've ever seen before or since. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, and that unnatural silence falls, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was watching me that day in 1999 is still out there, still watching, still hiding at the edges of our world.